Hi, this is Jeff Nyquist in the United States. This is another edition of Friends and Enemies, and with me is Alex Benesch in Germany. And we are going to discuss the aftermath of World War II, the lead in to the Cold War, and continuing our series on the conflicts of the 20th century. So, Alex, you were going to give an overview of all the countries and regions in the world, what it looked like at the end of World War II.
Right, just starting where we left off, just to give that overview. So you explained that very well in the last show, how it almost became a monumental disaster in Europe. So you were talking about this idea of the Soviets to leave the Americans hanging, so the Americans would fight it out with the Germans. Americans would not really get a foothold, and then the Soviet forces could march in and take all of Western Europe. But that plan didn't work out ultimately, and so the Soviets had to do with they had to settle for, of course, Ukraine, Poland, Eastern Germany, and more territories. And now when the Red Army came here, now I'm sitting in Germany here, when the Red Army came, they had pretty much a policy of rape, mass rape. And this is something you can expect in today's situation as well. For example, when Ukraine, or if Ukraine gets taken over, or a larger part of it, in other territories as well, when the Russian army approaches, they will have a sense of revenge and a mass rape program today.
I should
Just like,
interject. Yeah, I should interject just because it's a good point you're making. In Ukraine already, they have over 120,000 war crimes being investigated. So it isn't just, like the My Lai massacre in Vietnam. We had a few atrocities committed by Americans who went bad on the battlefield, but this is 120,000. This is systematic. This is coming from the command.
yeah.
This kind of level of atrocity. This is a Russian. This is a method of subduing the population. So I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, we also saw that when it came to the Syrian war, there was also a policy of mass rape and intimidation. You want to psychologically break the population that you're taking over, so they will stay subdued and quiet for the foreseeable future. Now, when it comes to Ukraine today, to draw that comparison, you may get you may even get a bigger organized rape program to create rape babies, because one of the big objectives of the Ukraine war for the Russians was the population. So it's the industry that Russia's military is highly dependent on. And the other thing is population. The demographics of Russia are terrible. They needed the population of Ukraine, and because so many people have already fled Ukraine, we might actually get to see, or this could be the intention of the Russians to, create a mass of rape babies and force people to have babies. Because already there's some talk in Russia of changing laws around where you can force women to marry, and you can basically force women to have babies. Now, there's some talk on television in Russia over there, because they're so desperate to continue their demographics. Just to give you a quick number, roughly, this is an estimate, roughly 1.9 million German women were raped at the end of the war, Second World War, by Red Army soldiers. About 1/3 of all German women in Berlin were raped by Soviet forces. And so that was the situation back then. You can expect maybe something even larger in Ukraine and
And
in
and
other
how many
territories.
pregnancies, how many children resulted from those
I
1.9
don't
million rapes?
I don't have that number here, but when the Cold War ended, you saw an influx of migrants from the former Soviet Union. So they called them German Russians, and these people, they descended from settlers, people who once sought another life in Tsarist Russia. And when the communists took over, that all changed. Everybody became a suspect who had German roots. This also happened to some people from my mother's family. There was people who left Germany, Germans who thought there was no space here, there was no opportunities here, so they went to Tsarist Russia, and they had a big horse breeding operation going, and then the Soviets took power. And one of my ancestors ended up in a gulag because he was deemed to be a landowner or just a capitalist who owned things, and so that he had to be removed from society. So this is just right at the end of the war. Now, of course, the Soviet Union had suffered a lot of losses, of course, themselves. The Soviet population decreased by about 27 million during the war. Of that, only 8.7 million were combat deaths. The remaining 19 million non-combat deaths had a variety of causes. Starvation in the siege of Leningrad. This is why Putin really hates Germans. This is why Putin really wants Germany. Conditions in German prisons and concentration camps, mass shootings, famine and disease, but also conditions in Soviet camps. So this, of course, was a staggering loss. Now, of course, the plan of, or the just allowing all these mass rapes, millions of rapes in Germany, it's a very bizarre policy, but it also indicates the intention of the Soviets to mass troops again, not demobilize the troops, and have another go at this, not being content with what they received after the war. They were figuring out that they could actually try again in the coming years. And that's why American planners came up with the contingency plan codenamed Operation Dropshot in 1949, considered possible nuclear and conventional war with the Soviets and its allies in order to counter a Soviet takeover of Western Europe, the Near East, and parts of Eastern Asia. So by treating people so harshly, the Soviets figured we don't have to treat people well, we don't have to win the hearts and minds of people. We're just gonna demoralize them and then try again in a few years with troops, essentially. And so the United States created this plan in order to deter the Soviets from trying this. This was already the atomic age, of course, and President Eisenhower adopted a strategy of massive retaliation, relying on a threat of a U.S. nuclear strike to prevent non-nuclear incursions by the Soviet Union in Europe and elsewhere. And of course, the Americans, they had strongly reduced their own troops. A lot of troops came home to the U.S., but the Soviets maintained a very, very large force. They even had a sizable force in Eastern Germany. So this was an invasion force. This was not just, as they would later claim, especially when they built the wall, this was not just a protection against, fascist imperialist attacks of some sort. This was strictly planned to, try again, really. Then, of course, in 1947, U.S. Secretary of State George Marshall devised the European Recovery Program. Most people know it as the Marshall Plan. Between 1948 and 1952, United States government allocated roughly $13 billion. That would be $177 billion in today's money for the reconstruction of the affected countries of Western Europe. And many countries were in trouble. The United Kingdom was in trouble. More than a quarter of its national wealth had been consumed. And the UK had been spending its assets to purchase American equipment, including aircraft and ships, over £437 million on aircraft alone. The Lend-Lease came just before the reserves were exhausted. Britain had placed 55% of its total labor force into war production. And only with the completion of the Anglo-American loan by the United States to Great Britain on July 15th, 1946, that some measure of economic stability was restored in Britain. The loan was made primarily to support British overseas expenditure in the immediate post-war years and not to implement the Labour government's policies for domestic welfare reforms and the nationalization of key industries. Now, you mentioned this in the previous shows. The communists had this elaborate plan in Britain to take over and just wait for the Soviet troops to come and just close the deal, and turn Britain into a communist hellhole.
Yeah, wherever the Red Army advanced, it converted the countries that it invaded into socialist states. Romania, Bulgaria, Yugoslavia, of course, Tito was already there, but the Red Army came there too. Of course, Poland, the Baltic states, and Eastern Germany and Austria. Austria is a funny case where they had occupation zones just like in Germany, because Austria was a part of the Third Reich. It was part of Germany during the war. But the collapse of Central Europe, we should mention this, that at Potsdam, which was where the final ultimatum was given to Japan, Potsdam was where Stalin, Attlee, and Truman met. You'll notice that Churchill's no longer there. Roosevelt is dead. Churchill lost the election, and Attlee got in. So you had a weird thing. The big three are now, two of the faces are new, basically, yeah. Truman and Attlee. So you have Stalin, but Stalin is still there. Stalin's the same right. guy. And this is an advantage when you've been having this war all along. The leaders changed in the United States and Great Britain, so none of the institutional memory was able to continue. And of course, these guys, Truman kind of was naive. He was as vice president. He was kept in the dark. He wasn't told anything. He didn't understand really fully what had happened at Yalta, where a lot of the agreements were made for a lot of people thought that the Soviet armies in Central Europe were going to go home, just like the American and British right. armies were going to go home. And that didn't happen. The Russians weren't going to go home. And it was General George Patton who basically made a big deal about this. And he, in this book, Target Patton, he told an American State Department official that came to see him, look, you have to give the Russians an ultimatum. Their armies have to go home to Russia. And of course, this actually frightened people in the U.S. government that Patton was talking this way. And Patton was saying, look, if they don't go, we need to make them go. And so Patton was becoming political. And then there was even a thought that Patton was going to come home and run against Truman in 48 or run for or become political, right? Set down his, and this is where in Target Patton, Stalin put a hit out on Patton, and it's alleged by this, I think his name was it Bazada? This hitman for the OSS, allegedly Donovan assigned him to kill Patton. So this is the kind of story. We don't really, it's all very murky and we can't really verify a lot of the details, but we do know what is verifiable is that Patton was making these noises about, you have to make the Russians leave. You can't be naive and let them sit here decade after decade because they'll never leave. And this was kind of a crisis and a beginning of the Cold War just in itself, that the Russians didn't abide by what the Allies thought the agreement was. We're going to have democracy. Poland's going to be free at the end of the war. No.
Yeah.
It wasn't going to happen.
In Western Germany, there was the economic miracle. Of course, partially because of that Marshall Plan. The initial idea had been to deindustrialize Germany, turn it into this farming country, which could never ever build a military force ever again.
Yeah,
but
the Morgenthau Plan.
Yeah, but then, of course, with the new idea, with the new plan, he saw this economic miracle. All these corporations were jump-started again. Ranging from Siemens, Volkswagen, BMW, Mercedes, chemical companies Höchst, Bayer, the pharmaceutical company Bayer.
Yeah.
And there was a very thorough counterintelligence program in Western Germany carried out by the Brits and the Americans, which was handled by the CIC at the time, the Counterintelligence Corps. And so they had hunted the last significant groups of Nazis. They had established the new political system, jump-started the economy, and obviously Soviet propaganda over time in the Cold War, they made a big deal out of the American counterintelligence efforts, and they just billed it as American imperialism. When you saw German companies just growing outside of Germany, they became these global players. Now, nowadays, people drive Volkswagens in America, they drive BMWs, and they...
and the same process in Japan, where the Americans drive Hondas
yeah.
and of course Nissans, right? So,
right.
Yeah, people don't realize our policy in Japan and Germany and the conquered countries was to help them become thriving commercial democracies where they could produce things for themselves.
And also in countries like Italy, after the war, the communists were really strong in Italy. The Communist Party of Italy was one of the biggest in the world, or biggest in the West, and so also we saw a variety of operations there by the Americans to make sure the communists wouldn't take over that country.
There was U.S. interference in Italian elections because there was fear that the communists would take over Italy.
Yeah, and to this day, I mean, the historians have not yet pieced together all of the communist efforts to funnel money to these Western communist parties. I mean, it's one thing if you have some sort of a late transparency, you get some of the files on American operations, all the stories that we now know about, suitcases full of cash. But also, if you look into some of the literature, like for example, Oleg Gordievsky's book, which is sitting up there in my shelf here, Gordievsky's book on the KGB, I think that one also has a bunch of examples of communist money being funneled into these political parties. The same thing in India. They were paying, the communists were trying to pay off everybody and distort the democratic process. So, and then there were some intelligence assets in Western Germany. They were infiltrating radical circles. They initially thought they were only going to investigate terrorism, left-wing communist terrorism, bomb makers, gun running, that sort of stuff. But they did figure out there was quite a bunch of money being moved from East Germany to West Germany in order to fund, the Communist Party over here in the West and some other political projects. And
there's another thing about Germany and Austria and also Hungary. Because those were the countries, Germany, Austria, and Hungary, where they took military personnel in large numbers, in hundreds and thousands. And actually, I don't know the total number of German POWs. It might have been over 1 million. I'm not sure what the number was, but they took a lot of them as prisoners to Russia to make them work to do labor in the Soviet Union. Yeah. And some of them, they worked to death. And I don't know the statistic of how many made it back to Germany alive. I understand they were still trickling back until the early 60s.
I think about a third came back, yeah.
About a third came back. That meant a third died in captivity in the Soviet Union. Do you know the number of German prisoners taken to the Soviet Union as slave labor? Do you know that number?
I don't remember that number, but I think that only a third of them actually returned.
And of course, that would be the armies that were fighting in the eastern part of Germany where the Soviet armies were operating. Of course, it's a smaller part of Germany. East Germany is not the bigger part. but it contains Berlin, the capital, which is a very large city. But what is not known, what is not well understood, and you have to read the memoirs of people who were prisoners. And I've read more than one memoir of German soldiers who were taken prisoner by the Russians and spent time in the Soviet Union in this program who made it back. One of the things they did is they separated the prisoners into two groups, actually more than two groups. There were those that they just used for slave labor, for hard labor. There were those who were skilled labor and were sent to build houses and dachas for party officials to make really sweet things. People who had really good capabilities. There weren't a lot of skilled labor in the Soviet Union at the end of the war, so they wanted this German skilled labor to make things for party officials. But for the rest, they're working in mines, very ugly working conditions, very poor food. But the one category was anybody who they identified as being related to a celebrity, a scientist, a high-level official who was connected to top generals or top politicians. They didn't put them in a labor camp. They didn't care about them as labor. They had a building in Moscow dedicated to these folks that they housed them in. And they gave them communist literature. They treated them very nicely. And they said, we want you to understand communism. We want you to understand our belief system. We want you to join us. And it was because of your relative or your friendships or your connections to important people in the media or in entertainment or science or whatever, anyone who had one of these connections, that the Soviets realized they wanted to cultivate these prisoners. And so that's what they did. They have indoctrination sessions. They'd have private one-on-one counseling with these people. And the whole idea was, you get to go home to Germany. And they actually preferred them to move to West Germany rather than to be in the East. We want you to go back to Germany and influence your relatives, friends, contacts to be pro-Soviet, right? So that is of the hundreds of thousands of German prisoners taken into captivity, they selected an elite cadre of them to come back as influence agents.
Yeah.
Because they already were in position to influence other important people.
Uniquely, Eastern Germany was a place where you had a choice for a number of years to actually stay or go. Now, in other communist states, this was very restricted. Now, the entire Soviet Union had the system of, relocation and just moving populations around, and you needed special permission to visit another country or just to live somewhere else. But until 1961, when they built the wall and they had all these, they closed the border entirely. Until 61, as a German, you had the choice of going to the West, and many
61,
people
of course, is when the Berlin Wall went up.
Yeah, and so many people did that. So they voted with their feet against communism, and they went to the West. And this was ultimately the reason why the border was closed, just to stop the outflow of people.
The flood of people, people just did not want to live under communism. If they had the chance, they would go to West Germany, where they could have freedom.
There were a few odd ducks who actually went the other way. They went from West Germany to East Germany. And
Angela Merkel's father,
exactly, Mr. Kastner. He was Mr. Kastner. He actually went the other way, and people thought he was crazy. That, of course, happened too, but that was very, very rare. So most people actually voted against communism by just leaving. Now, of course, for a long time, the Soviets had to pretend to their own people that the life in the West was terrible and life in the East was plentiful. But of course, with all the economic miracle and people owning houses and driving cars and having refrigerators and television sets and all that stuff, it became a vastly different world once you cross the border. It was
Germany has this in common with Korea, where you have the DMZ in Korea, and the people in North Korea are starving, and the people in South Korea are extremely prosperous. And so you had East Germany and West Germany, not quite as stark as a contrast as in Korea, but still, anybody with eyes in their head could see that West Germany was a much nicer place to live than East Germany,
Yeah, and
right?
also there were quite a few uh, inner German, let's call them that, inner German refugees, people who lived in East Prussia, for example, under the rulership of Erich Koch, which we talked about in previous shows, who may have been a communist agent. He botched the escape of people. The orderly escape of people was completely botched, so people had to escape in the middle of winter on foot with little carts. And so these people ran from the Red Army, they ran from the Soviets, and obviously once they had reached what's now considered East Germany, because Germany used to be larger. And so when they arrived in what's now East Germany, they really weren't keen to stick around and live under a Soviet-style government. They went further to the west, and so some of these people, like the family of my wife, they were refugees essentially. So they lived in abject poverty for a few months or a few years, but then they started to build a life, and they learned new skills, and they got degrees, and they became quite successful. They absolutely voted against communism in that way. And Western Germany was a place where the Soviets tried to buy people everywhere. Famous example would be Heinz Felfe, who had this big career growing in the Nazi era, but then he found himself out of work, and he started to spy for the British at first, but then he opted to work for the Soviets, and they paid him a lot of money. That happened quite a lot. So West Germany, or what's now reunified Germany, is a very, very infiltrated country. So that is a problem that persists to this very day, because if you try to rebuild a country, these are the people you have to work with. And it was a large effort by the Americans through the CIC, the Counterintelligence Corps, and later, of course, the CIA. But you can only do so much. You work with a country that has been highly infiltrated by the communists. And so that, of course, became a very large issue in
I
the
mean,
Cold
we're
War.
talking about 100,000 agents were discovered at the end of the Cold War, working in various branches of Germany's government.
Exactly, and we still don't
You
have
know,
all the files. Just when it comes to the East German Stasi, sometimes people hear about a particular data set which was purchased at the end of the Cold War by the Americans. This was not a full set of Stasi agents in the West. This was not a full set of
no,
operations.
no.
And then we got a backup copy of a computer system that the Stasi was using. But also, that was not a full set of agents and operations and structure. This was an experimental backup copy that was used to test a systems migration. You would go from one computer system to the new computer system, and they were doing a dry run, a test run. So they used a half real database and half gibberish database, and they used that for that testing purpose. And ultimately, we got a copy of that database, but it's not what we would like it to be. So a lot of this stuff was shredded and burned at the end of the Cold War. The KGB, of course, they had a full set of everything. They acquired copies over the years. They have everything, but we don't. So that chapter has never been properly closed. Now, of course, when the Soviets they didn't get what they wanted in Western Europe, they were already trying to, try it again. It's have a massive army, move and just take all of Western Europe. The Americans were holding that off. The nuclear program of the Americans was gaining in size quite a bit. Now, if you look at these overlaid statistics of American warheads and Soviet warheads, the Soviets were behind, even though they had taken everything they could find in Eastern Germany to use for the Soviet nuclear program. So they were taking scientists, they were taking a 60-ton cyclotron, they were taking uranium, anything they could find. They were stripping industrial applications that were not nuclear applications, but they were stripping these applications for these little bits and pieces because they couldn't make it themselves, and they needed that for the atomic program in the Soviet Union. So they were years behind the Americans, and that's why that additional invasion of Western Europe didn't take place. So the Soviets try on the other end of the world. Soviet forces invaded Manchuria. This was the expulsion of all Japanese settlers, and the Soviet Union dismantled the industrial base in Manchuria that the Japanese had built up, and it subsequently became a base for the communist Chinese forces because of the Soviet occupation. And after the war, the Allies rescinded Japanese empire pre-war annexations such as Manchuria and Korea. Korea became military occupied by the United States in the south and by the Soviet Union in the north. The Philippines and Guam were returned to the United States. Burma, Malaysia, and Singapore were returned to Britain, and Indochina back to France. So this was the world right after World War II. So everybody just looked ahead of what would come next. And at the time, of course, China was in a China had been in a critical situation for decades. I mean, this was a very chaotic situation.
I might explain the China situation. China had a revolution in the early 20th century in which you had Sun Yat-sen, who was sort of the George Washington of the Chinese Republic, and his right-hand guy became Chiang Kai-shek, who, when Sun Yat-sen died, and I forget what year that was, Chiang Kai-shek became the leader of the Nationalist Party, which was the ruling party of the Chinese Republic. The problem was China was very large. It had warlords controlling certain areas, and you had the Kuomintang was the Nationalist Party. That's the Chinese name of it. And it included communists initially, so that the communists were part of it. And believe it or not, it was the policy of Stalin and the Politburo in Moscow to support the nationalist, the Chinese nationalists, to support the Kuomintang. So General Chiang Kai-shek was originally supported by the Soviet Union. Okay, and they were seeing that there were communists inside the Kuomintang, and they thought, well, they could eventually, emerge to control the Kuomintang, maybe from inside. And so Chiang Kai-shek sent his son to be educated in the Soviet Union. And then Chiang Kai-shek made a tour of the Soviet Union, and I think it was 1926, if I'm remembering right. And he realized that the Soviet Union was a Potemkin village, that it was a lie, that socialism didn't work, and that this wasn't going to be right for China. And even though he had foolishly sent his son to be educated in the Soviet Union, and his son was virtually a hostage of Stalin, Chiang Kai-shek decided to break with the communists. So at some point after he got back from his trip to the Soviet Union, he announced a purge of the communists from the Kuomintang. And this initiated the Long March, where the communists left the areas of control of the Chinese, the Kuomintang, the Chinese Nationalist Party, and went to the north to a place called Yan'an, that's closer to the Soviet Union, where they could get support. And they set up their Yan'an Republic, which was a communist Chinese area in the mountains where they were kind of insulated. This was the Long March that they went up there. All the communists went there because they were going to be exterminated by the Kuomintang if they didn't. And of course, this created a crisis for the Soviet Union because Chiang Kai-shek betrayed the Soviet Union, right? Mm-hmm. And then what Chiang did is, as for his military advisors, he took German military advisors after that. And by the way, the Germans had involvement in China before World War I, and they were greatly liked, unlike many of the other imperial powers that were not liked by the Chinese, like the British. the Chinese got along well with the German sinologists and people who would come there, military people. So there was a kind of growing relationship, which is ironic because you think Germany having this military
Mm,
relationship with China, later they're allied with Japan during the war, which was Hitler's doing. It wasn't the doing of the German generals who preferred to be with the nationalists. So this is the setup. And so a civil war basically was occurring before the Japanese invasion in 1937. There was a civil war between the communists and the nationalists where the communists were kind of in the worst position, right? But that invasion created an opportunity. The communists actually kidnapped or got captured Chiang Kai-shek and forced a
oops.
deal, a unification, a common front between the communists and the nationalists in fighting the Japanese invaders. Meanwhile, the communists were secretly making secret backdoor deals with the Japanese Imperial Army so that
Yeah.
all the heat would go on the nationalists. And this is the way it went. It was a kind of a three-way conflict with the Japanese invader, the communists, and so when the Japanese were defeated at the end of the war, the competition between the communists and the nationalists resumed. Only this time with the Soviet army occupying Manchuria, which was the most industrialized part of China, by the way, and had a lot of resources, and the North. This and giving the captured Japanese military equipment to the communist Chinese, this greatly empowered the communist military
Mm,
position in China
yeah,
in
and
and
also,
after World War II.
yeah, and people would think that because of the involvement of the British, they knew the area. They had a long history with China. You would think that the British would have understood how to repel communism, how to regain control, work with the Americans, work with the Chinese nationalists, because Britain was such a mature empire, and when all this chaos happened in the decades before in China, you could sort of see the weaknesses of China in terms of counterintelligence, weapons technology. China lost pace. They were backwards in many ways. The administration was very slow. The language was overly complicated. So you have to imagine a Chinese ruler in a certain area gives an order. How long does it take for the order to reach all these rural areas and all these local administrators? It would take forever. And how much of that order would actually be carried out? So this is something that had helped the British in order to gain some sort of control over China. So there was all this experience, but at that stage of the game, the end of World War II, at that stage of the game, the British already had a massive problem with communist infiltration. This is something that went past most people in Britain, even in the higher classes, because when these big moles were discovered, one after the other, you could sort of see the reaction in Britain going from this was just a fluke, okay, maybe there was two flukes, maybe three flukes, okay, now we have a serious problem. In the following years, with the Cambridge Five and all these people. Now, first, when the atomic spies were discovered, Klaus Fuchs, for example, famous example, Klaus Fuchs, he was a German communist, Jewish background. His whole family was communist. Somehow the British missed all of this. And Klaus Fuchs was then able to work on the British nuclear program, the Tube Alloys project. And then Klaus Fuchs was then shipped to America to work on the Manhattan Project, and the British had promised the Americans, we thoroughly vetted this man. We just
Yeah,
triple-checked
thank you,
everything.
Sir Roger Hollis,
Yeah.
who ultimately became the head of MI5. Roger Hollis, of course, accused by his deputy director um, of being a Soviet agent in the 1980s.
Yeah,
I mean, he was dead by
exactly.
then, but
Yeah,
yeah,
so that
the spy catcher scandal.
when
Yeah.
when Fuchs was exposed, the reaction in Whitehall was fairly strange. The British thought, well, he was Jewish and he was kind of German and he was not really British, so we're not that surprised that he turned out to be a trader, you could never expect this to happen with an older British family. You know, these young men that go to Cambridge, those guys would never become Soviet agents. But of course, that's exactly what happened. They did become Soviet agents. So this happened
Yeah,
in
you're talking
stages.
about Kim Philby and
And yeah,
Burgess and
and
McLean and
initially
Blunt.
the Americans really trusted the British in terms of intelligence because of all that British history and the British intelligence successes against the Germans. You know, the performance was really good. So the assumption was that the British would perform. The British would perform as well when it came to the Soviets, but this was not the case. So Britain was compromised, and that became a problem in Asia as well, specifically with China. One of the big officials who was active in China at the time was Lord Louis Mountbatten. You know, the infamous Louis, I think they call him Dickie. And
Well,
Mountbatten,
wasn't he the commander of the British forces in East Asia in
that's
Burma?
correct. That's correct. Yeah.
Yeah.
And
And of course, Burma, to explain what happened with Burma, because Burma's in the news now today with the rebellion that's going on, the uprising against the military junta or whatever. Burma was strategic for a reason that in World War II that is kind of hard to understand. China was one of the strategies of Japan after they invaded China. Japan was trying, of course, to conquer China. America and the British were sympathetic to China. And so they wanted to give China supplies, military supplies, to keep China going because China didn't have the industrial base, especially when the main industrial parts of the country were occupied by the Japanese early in the war. You know, Shanghai and Beijing were occupied by the Japanese. They had largely retreated into the mountainous interior of China. And of course, as the Japanese closed off the entire coast and closed off, then occupied Indochina, the only way to get supplies to nationalist China was through Burma, through something called the Burma Road, which went up over the high mountains, over the Himalayan mountains, and into China. And the reason the Japanese needed to invade Burma, which they did early in the war in 1942, is to cut that road, the Burma Road, which came from India into Burma and then on up. And of course, it was very key to supplying nationalist China, keeping nationalist China in the war. And of course, for Mountbatten to be in charge of the Commonwealth forces in India and Burma meant that he was directly involved in supporting nationalist China. This is the same thing with General Stilwell, who was sent by General Marshall to be the military aide to Chiang Kai-shek, who actually hated the nationalist Chinese, hated Chiang Kai-shek, Stilwell, and who knows why, favored the communists more than, would be more friendly to Mao ultimately than to Chiang Kai-shek. So both Britain and America had leading figures, generals who were destined to undermine the nationalists and help the communists. George Marshall, the chief of the American General Staff, at the end of the war, after he gave testimony on Pearl Harbor in December 1945, was then tasked by Truman to go to China, the Marshall mission to China, to stop the Chinese Civil War, to get the nationalists and the communists to get along with each other. And of course, he did great damage to the nationalists in this whole process. And it was argued later that he enabled the Chinese communist takeover of China.
Yeah. So Lord Louis Mountbatten was a very, very strange man, and British secret services became suspicious of him, but he was untouchable. The French services became suspicious of him. Even the American FBI became suspicious of Mountbatten and opened a file on him.
Well, you might say, what will his ultimate relationship to British royalty be?
Well, I mean, he was right in the middle of the royal family. Now, the name Mountbatten is bogus, just so people understand this. Mountbatten is just an anglicized version of Buttonbag, right? You just translate that directly. And this name just came about because one of his ancestors married against the family rules. Okay, so His real name would be, or the family name of him would be Hessen. Now, this is the same Hessen, by the way, that sent, what was it, 15,000 mercenaries to America to fight the rebels in the American Revolutionary War. Some people may remember the Hessian mercenaries. And, the Landgraf of Hessen at the time, he was grossly overpaid by the British to provide these mercenaries, and that was sort of a hidden money laundering scheme, so that the House of Hessen could conduct more operations, secret operations. But that's a whole nother topic. So his real name would be Hessen, very, very close to the actual throne of Britain. And his very close ancestors, they were the same family that held the Tsarist throne in Russia. Now, the Tsars were the houses of Hessen and Schleswig-Holstein, so there's this connection. But Mountbatten had actual, real communist contacts, serious communist contacts, and he also had a almost direct line of communication with the Soviets. There were quite a few people, officials in Britain, who hated that, who rang the alarm bells, but Mountbatten was untouchable. Now, there's, of course, the danger that a family like Hessen had tried to stay relevant and try to stay powerful by aligning with the communists or by having a working relationship with the communists. Because who needed the royals in the 20th century? Who needed these grossly overpaid people with, their own agenda? I mean, nobody really needed them. But in order to stay relevant, that may or may not have been the intention of Lord Louis Mountbatten.
And of course, you had a socialist government coming into power in 1945 in Great Britain, and Britain was taking the socialist turn. So what was the future of the monarchy? What was the future of Britain? Was it going to become a socialist country?
Yeah.
Even though it was not occupied by the Red Army.
And by the way, there was also, even before the communist revolution in Russia, there were also some kinds of ideas floated around. For example, some of these communists like Mikhail Bakunin talked about this. There was this idea of keeping the Tsar, keeping the throne, but have socialism underneath, right? So they toyed with all kinds of concepts and ideas. And maybe this had an influence on Lord Louis Mountbatten, that he was sympathetic to a communist idea, to have a communist system in Russia, because it may have provided an opportunity for him, so his family could stay relevant. And also there was a compromising element. This was mentioned in the book War of the Windsors, when after World War II, there was a specific job that Lord Louis Mountbatten had, which was to retrieve secret communications from Germany, occupied Germany, correspondences from wartime between these aristocratic families that were tied to Britain. Now, I strongly suspect that there was a whole lot of espionage going on against the Nazis, but all sorts of shenanigans that were not just embarrassing for the British monarchy, but stuff that could potentially destroy the monarchy. And
well, there were relatives. Wasn't one or two of the sisters of Prince Philip who married Queen Elizabeth? Didn't they marry Nazi functionaries or Nazi noblemen connected with the Nazis? Right.
There was him, and there was also Prince Bernhard of the Netherlands. He was also very much tied into this whole Nazi this whole Nazi sphere, and so there was stuff in this correspondence that could potentially destroy the monarchy and the aristocracy. And it was Lord Louis Mountbatten's job to retrieve all those documents from the German castles, and he picked a certain man to retrieve those documents, and that man was Anthony Blunt, who was a communist traitor, a communist spy. So there's, of course, this compromising element that the Soviets probably had this material against Mountbatten and against all of his relatives. And so there's these two motivations probably that were at work here. One, protect yourself, make a deal with the communists. They would stay quiet about the material, but you would have to give Soviets access to British institutions, British intelligence, and the British knew a bunch of stuff about American intelligence as well. So Um,
So let me ask you, did Mountbatten have any inputs on the China situation with the civil war between the nationalists and the communists like Marshall did?
I have this in my I have some of it in my notes here when it comes to the Korean War and also the China War. Um, there's of course some suspicious American activity where you would suspect communist infiltration on the American side. And it seems likely that Mountbatten had some people on the American side as well. He could work with, and this is a chapter in history that's never been fully reconstructed. And in terms of Mountbatten, he was regarded untouchable because of his family ties. But any other person with his record in his context, any other person would probably have been arrested and interrogated. Nobody could do these things other than somebody of the, Mountbatten's status. He if you had Mountbatten's communist contacts, you would not get any job in the British government. You could not get a security clearance. You could not work a low-level desk job in the intelligence world or in the military. You would not get that clearance at all. And that became a mess. And just as the Americans had trusted the British when it came to these atomic scientists, the Americans had some sort of trust in the British when it came to China because the British had a long history in China. So you would assume this would all work out the way you intended to work out. But once you have a significant communist breach in Britain's leadership, that can all go very much sideways. Because the reigning monarch in Britain always had access to all intelligence. I mean, even Queen Elizabeth, she got this daily brief, a red box, where she would get all the intelligence. She was required to either burn these documents or hand them back in completely. And so she had access to everything. And once you have that family connection, you can inform other people in the family. You could share this information around, even though this was not officially condoned. This was just for the Queen's or the King's eyes only, not for Dickie Mountbatten and some of these other guys. And it's a huge problem, and I think that showed itself in this China debacle. Trying to scroll here through my notes where I have this this war in
Yeah,
China.
let's talk about how Free China or the Republic of China was undermined. There was an organization called the Institute for Pacific um, what was it called? The Institute for Pacific Research. No, it was called the Institute for Pacific Relations. Sorry about that. Founded in 1925, and it was founded supposedly in the spirit of Wilsonian, spreading democracy everywhere. But it got infiltrated by communists, and during the war, it was used as a center for subverting Chiang Kai-shek's position. So they were very pro-Mao, they turned out to be, and very anti-Chiang. And this got exposed towards the end of World War II when it was found that that some of the leadership of the IPR was, had communist sympathies. So the FBI started looking at it, and of course, they were aligned with Amerasia, which was a magazine, not a magazine, but I think it was like a group that produced reports and did publications. And they FBI found 115 people who contributed articles for it had communist connections. And so there were these other groups like the Committee for a Democratic Far Eastern Policy was housed in the same building as IPR. And it turned out to be this giant nest of spies working for Stalin. And there were even some of them who had been associated with Sorge, the Sorge spy ring,
Right.
which was the Soviet spy ring in Japan. And they really did a great deal for promoting Mao as an agrarian reformer, not a communist. And Chiang was corrupt. We hear this now about Ukraine.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, in 1949, because of the undermining that was done of Chiang's position in China, the nationalist armies collapsed. And in 1949, the Chinese communists won the Civil War in China. That's how China, the most populous country in the world at the time, became a communist country, was through all these different, you could call them non-government organizations, influencing government policy and going in and out of government, going in and out of the State Department, effectively, cut Chiang off of support of the Americans under the umbrella of we're being even-handed about trying to reconcile Mao and Chiang. And there were deals made where the United States would not supply Chiang with weapons if Stalin didn't supply the nationalists with weapons. Of course, Stalin broke that agreement and supplied, the communists with weapons. Stalin supplied the communists with weapons. And so this became a shock to the American people in 1949, because in 1949, two things happened. Not only did China become communist, but Stalin got the bomb. That was the
Right.
year that, oh my gosh, the Soviet Union has the atomic bomb. How did that happen? And how did China become communist? And so there were all these investigations started in the United States to find out where the blame lied, that this catastrophe had happened, that China, who was our friend, now had joined the Soviet Union, that was now, with the Cold War ignited, our enemy. And how did they get the bomb? And this ended up causing investigation by the Republican Congress. The Republicans at that point had gotten control of Congress, of the Democratic administration under Truman, and before that under Roosevelt, exposing the fact they were suddenly discovering there were Soviet agents, Stalin's agents, all over the Roosevelt
Mm.
administration, influencing policy. This is the key thing, influencing the policies that caused these disasters.
Right. Here is
Yeah.
a reading suggestion. It's a book. It's called Stilwell and Mountbatten in Burma by Jonathan Templin Ritter. This is from a series which is called American Military Studies. And it says here, Stilwell and Mountbatten in Burma explores the relationship between American General Joseph Vinegar Joe Stilwell and British Admiral Lord Louis Mountbatten in the China-Burma-India Theater and the Southeast Asia Command between October of 1943 and October 1944, using original material from American and British archives. It says, although much has been written about the theater, Stilwell and China and Mountbatten, no published comparison study has focused on the relationship between the two men during the 12-month period in which their careers overlapped. This book bridges the gap in the literature between Mountbatten's earlier naval career and his later role as the last viceroy of British India. It also presents original archival material that explains why Stilwell was so anti-British, including his 1935 memorandum titled The British and his original margin notes to Mountbatten's farewell letter to him in 1944. Finally, it presents other original archival material that refutes previous books that have accused Stilwell of needlessly sacrificing the lives of his men during the 1944 North Burma campaign merely out of hatred for the British. So you can see how the narratives can be shaped, right?
Yeah, Stilwell was a very, old vinegar. He was a very difficult personality. He hated Chiang Kai-shek. He didn't like the British. And of course, the Burma campaign, the American forces, by the way, in the Burma campaign were relatively small. Most of the forces were British. But there was this contingent of Americans. And of course, Burma is jungle and mountain. It's a very, very dangerous. It was defended by 4 Japanese imperial divisions, which Japanese division is half again as strong as a Western division, because they had 21,000 man divisions. But they held Burma fiercely. And one of the British generals commented that we talk about fighting to the last man. The Japanese do it. So it was extremely treacherous fighting, and fighting in very difficult conditions. So it was very easy if you didn't cooperate in these commando and it was like guerrilla warfare type fighting in these remote places in the mountains and in the, North Burma mountain and jungle. And so you could easily lose men and suffer casualties in these situations. So yeah, coordination. Stilwell had a nickname for Chiang Kai-shek. I think he called him Peanut, which is very disrespectful, right? To
Yeah.
call the head of nationalist China a peanut. Call him peanut.
It says here, in August of 1943, Churchill appointed Mountbatten the Supreme Allied Commander, Southeast Asia Command, with promotion to acting full admiral. And British interpreter Hugh Lungi recounted an embarrassing episode during the Potsdam Conference when Mountbatten, desiring to receive an invitation to visit the Soviet Union, repeatedly attempted to impress Joseph Stalin with his former connections to the Russian imperial family. The attempt fell predictably flat, with Stalin dryly inquiring whether it was some time ago that he had been there. Says Lungi, the meeting was embarrassing because Stalin was so unimpressed. He offered no invitation. Mountbatten left with his tail between his legs. Wow. I mean, he really tried. I mean, he really did try. And
he wanted to be the buddy of, but of course, you see, if Stalin knew that they had blackmail on Mountbatten, the last thing he wanted to do was to see Mountbatten cozy up to him publicly.
yeah, I mean, of course,
Right?
this Mountbatten's sexual adventures were so compromising that even the FBI had a file on him on this as well.
And his
And
wife too, right? His
yeah, his
wife had
wife,
sexual adventures.
Edwina, I think she was called Edwina. She also had communist contacts, by the way. And to top it all off, there was a woman who was from, I think, from an aristocratic background, and she also, I think, had some ties to America. And she was in the party scene, the high society party scene, and she relayed to the FBI, or somehow her statements ended up in the FBI file about Mountbatten. And she said that Mountbatten was not only bisexual, but he also had an interest in minors, sex with minors, and the FBI knew about that. And so 2 years, or roughly 2 years after that meeting, when Mountbatten tried so desperately to impress Stalin, about 2 years later, Mountbatten sends Anthony Blunt, a Soviet traitor, to retrieve all this secret correspondence from German castles, and then, of course, the Soviets most likely had copies of that. Now, how did that
Sure they would.
influence Mountbatten's attitude towards the Soviet Union?
Going to what happened in 49 and 50, the shock of 1949. Let's talk a minute about what happened in India with Mountbatten and the beginning of the unraveling of the British Empire.
Yeah, I mean, the British, they had a huge problem in their former colonies because of technological advances, and so this whole traditional way of doing things, like controlling a colony, this whole traditional way didn't really pay off anymore. This wasn't really feasible to do, because it's one thing if you can subdue a population that is armed with spears and bows and arrows, and you have rifles or even the early machine guns, right? So once the power shifts, once it changes, the British Empire had to change significantly. They had to rely more on the intelligence methods, and they needed to at least have some sort of an independence in these former colonies, and they had to wrap this up, wind down certain operations, but still keep an intelligence presence in those colonies. But when it came to releasing India, a partitioning of India had to be done. Everybody knew this, and so this was Mountbatten's job, and he got himself a prestigious lawyer who had no experience with India, and they hatched out this plan to divide up India and to redraw the borders. And they came up with this plan in a few weeks, and they jumped the surprise on everybody. Here's the plan, blindsided everybody. It was the dumbest plan imaginable, and this had a tremendous effect on India moving closer to the Soviet Union. And this is one of the chapters in history that was disastrous for NATO in its early
It was
stages.
disastrous, yeah. The Russians had always postured under the Soviet Union as being supporters of national liberation movements. They called it later, but aligning with Islam and and aligning with people who wanted to be independent of, for example, French or British imperialism. And we're going to see this in Southeast Asia and with France and Algeria, because these areas are going to also start fighting for their independence against the French Empire. And of course, you had the Indian National Congress, which was an Indian independence organization that began in the province of Bengal. And of course, Mahatma Gandhi became the kind of leader of this, using civil disobedience. You had Nehru, who was associated with him. You had all these Indians who wanted India to be free from British rule. They wanted home rule. And and this, of course, evolved through the war because British troops fought in the Indian troops fought in the British Army famously during World War II in Africa and other places, and of course fought against the Japanese as well. So by the time you get to 1947, you have this Indian Independence Act, which was passed in 1947. And of course, I think the Congress Party was expecting India to be one country. But of course, the Muslims were not going to accept living in a country that was ruled by Hindus, and they wanted to be independent. And of course, we'll go ahead. So Mountbatten facilitated this partitioning of India.
Excuse me?
You were saying, so I was just kind of giving the background of this independence of India and how now it's divided between
Right.
Muslim and Hindu basically. And so what was the role that Mountbatten specifically played in this partition, which kind of favored Pakistan? Because didn't Pakistan get a lot of the military stuff?
The
Um,
partitioning was, well, the job he had, and his assistants had. The job was to find the least worst way of partitioning India, to not have tension, to not create more problems that were already there. But the plan they ultimately surprised everybody with, the plan was so terrible that massive problems arose, many dead people, many mutilated people. This created an
because
enormous chaos.
you basically had Muslim and Hindu populations intermixed in certain
Right.
regions. And once they were looking at getting their own state, a Muslim state or a Hindu state, they were then violently agitated against each other,
Yeah.
which caused an
So,
outbreak of tremendous violence.
and of course, at the time, the British needed a certain presence still in India to surveil the Soviet nuclear program. So when Mountbatten did all this planning and it all went sideways, this caused a great concern to many people, even in Britain. And also, one of the assistants or one of the close partners of Mountbatten, this was Baron Hastings Ismay, he became the first Secretary General of NATO. And this was not the only theater that they messed up for NATO. And so this was in here about the partition of India. So Mountbatten was known to have sympathies for the Labour Party. Okay, so this is the Social Democrat left-wing party in Britain. Mountbatten was very sympathetic to Labour, and so
Which was
Mountbatten's
the party
wife,
in power in 1947 in
right?
Britain, of course.
So Mountbatten's wife was friends with Menon. This was Vengali Krishna Menon in India. He was a very powerful person. And so, because of all these connections, this Krishna Menon guy was suggesting Mountbatten's name, um, was suggesting Mountbatten's name to take on this grand role, to make Mountbatten the viceroy of India. And there was these secret meetings to make this happen with Sir Stafford Cripps and Clement Attlee, who was running the Labour government. He was
Yeah, Clement Attlee was, just to interject this was famously Churchill's statement on Clement Attlee was that he was a sheep in sheep's clothing. That's kind of his joke. The Clement Attlee was kind of stupid. And Clement Attlee was the Prime Minister of Britain from 1945 when Labour beat the Tories in the election and Churchill lost power until 1951 when Churchill returned to power in the United Kingdom. So that was the period when all these catastrophes, when this Cold War began. And Churchill actually came, when he was out of power, to the United States, to Fulton, Missouri, and gave his famous Iron Curtain Has Descended speech, which I think was also in 1947. And so this was a very critical turning point, not just for India and for the Cold War and for don't forget for China, because they were in the midst of their civil war there in China in those years. So this was when this whole thing was unfolding, this catastrophe was unfolding.
Yeah.
And of course, as you point out, India became ultimately a client state of the Soviet Union. They would refer to themselves as non-aligned, but the country got heavily infiltrated. And after Gandhi's assassination, of course, Nehru became the Prime Minister of India. And ultimately, Pakistan was picked up as an ally of Communist China. So they had a scissors strategy going, the Chinese communists and the Russian communists, on the Indian subcontinent to keep, and partitioning India was important because it neutralized India as a power that could, because India is a huge country with huge potential, as a country that could go out and interfere with communist activities in the surrounding regions.
Yeah, and so this Clement Attlee guy, he was very active in Fabian society circles, became a lecturer at the London School of Economics. And so when we look at these structures of British, let's call it British social democracy or socialism, right? When we look at this, I think we have two things going on at the same time. And one of these would be bad enough, but there were two things going on at the same time. One was, of course, the standard communist infiltration attempts, against Britain. And the other thing was, what I mentioned before, this idea from people like Mountbatten, in order to stay relevant or in order to have a future as this powerful, aristocratic family cluster, to stay relevant, there was also a drive to have some sort of a stronger relationship with socialism, because some people noted when it came to India and when it came to some of these former British colonies, that particular brand of socialism, to some, was still kind of married to British imperialism. So some people thought this is a bit suspicious if you have a new facade maybe for British imperialism. So I think there were both things going on at the same time. Some people were thinking in the British system, it's going to turn out okay. They thought this was not going to be a communist takeover of Britain. This was going to be a more friendly-looking British imperialism. But the communists in all of this, they became really, really strong, stronger than I think many people in the British upper classes
we should discuss the Fabian
understood.
Society. We should probably discuss the Fabian Society for a second. The Fabian, the where does the word come from? Well, there was a Roman general, Quintus Fabius Maximus. He was the famous general during the Punic War, and Fabius was famous for what they called the Fabian strategy, which was after Hannibal had won like 3 major battles and crushed Roman armies, especially when he destroyed 2 consular armies at Cannae, at the Battle of Cannae. The Fabius, Quintus Fabius Maximus, became dictator, and his policy was not to fight a battle. His policy was to always just sort of, uh, just sort of run into the hills and be kind of like a guerrilla warfare kind of
Mm.
deal. Low intensity, like don't directly engage. And the reason that the British socialists picked this, their symbol was, and this is why the joke Churchill on Attlee, their symbol was a wolf in sheep's clothing, right?
Yeah.
So they wanted to be nice. They didn't want to scare people with Bolshevism, with violent communist revolutionary. They wanted to do everything without a battle, without a revolution, right? Without a violent revolution. So this kind of underscored that they weren't violent, communists. They were Fabian, that is, non-confrontational, non-fighting a battle socialists.
Yeah.
And this is where Churchill then makes the joke, yeah, a wolf in sheep's clothing. He's a sheep in sheep's clothing.
He got
Okay.
yeah, okay,
Yeah.
he got the joke right. Yeah, I mean, so I would imagine that somebody like Mountbatten, right? Mountbatten probably told other people in the higher ranks of Britain, he probably told them, don't worry, this is not going to be a communist takeover. It's just our brand of socialism. We're going to be fine. We're going to have, in these former colonies, we're going to have these strong governments that will nationalize, control these industries. It's going to work out fine. But the Soviets had Mountbatten. So he could tell these other people, don't worry, we're not going to lose control over this left-wing movement we're involved in. We're going to run it. But the Soviets apparently were running Mountbatten. So this was becoming a whole cluster of problems. Because, I mean, you would think that Britain, as a very mature empire, Britain would not have any of this socialist nonsense. They would just have different parties and run a tight ship there. But they were allowing the Fabian Society, they were allowing the London School of Economics. I think the founder of the London School of Economics was King George II, or the foundation stone came from one of the King Georges. So they thought, we're going to be running this, or they told people, we're going to be running this, don't worry, we'll control socialism. But socialism was controlling Mountbatten, and that created a massive, just barrage of problems for Britain, even as far away as, India or China and Burma. Right. So,
yeah, and of course India going and becoming independent in 1947, that was the crown jewel of the British Empire. And of course it had been I think Joseph Schumpeter, who wrote a book on imperialism before World War One. If I remember the dates, it was a study. The British Empire, people don't understand. It was a trading system, but it was a drain. Colonies really don't produce a lot of wealth. This was not understood. People think that having colonies makes you rich. It can, in some respects, it can bring in some advantages in terms of trade, but in general, it is not. As Joseph Schumpeter pointed out, it is not efficient. Colonialism is not economic efficiency, and of course, so a lot of people think that Britain lost its wealth because of the war, or because it turned to socialism, or because it lost its empire. Well, the answer is B, because it turned to socialism. Britain's economy never recovered from the war because they instituted socialist measures. So, for example, like in America, we had prosperity a few years after the war. In Britain, they still had rationing.
Yeah.
After, 5 years after the war, they still have rationing in Britain. So you have Eric Blair, whose pen name is George Orwell, who wrote Animal Farm, wrote 1984, which was originally 1948. He was describing, Britain, British socialism, ingsoc, he called it in the book. So socialism takes over and it creates this Western Soviet Union, basically. So he envisioned this world. He saw socialism taking over the West. And then these perpetual wars between these giant socialist states, that was sort of his vision in the book 1984, which is sort of a landmark. And of course, it didn't quite happen because Churchill came back to power in 1951. And of course, the United States, they elected Republicans to Congress. And there was a anti-communist, they call it a Red Scare in the United States. but people became aware that communism was a problem, and so it didn't immediately take over the West. But there was this feeling that they could have done so.
Yeah, here's an interesting bit about Edwina Mountbatten, who married, who married Louis Mountbatten. So, um, Edwina's mother was the only child of the international magnate Sir Ernest Cassel, who was Jewish. And Mr. Cassel, he was very close to the future king Edward VII. And so Edwina, so of course, Edwina was sent to these very conventional boarding schools, right? Um, and and so in these, there was kind of a problem at these boarding schools. She described her experience as sheer hell. And there was a lot of bullying involved. Now, of course, even though you are in these high circles and you have all this money and all this background, you still get bullied. And this, of course, so this, of course, made her somewhat alienated, somewhat unhappy. So this is something that we've seen over and over again in Europe when you have some members of aristocratic families that are really, really unhappy. And we see a bunch of those unhappy aristocrats joining communism or having communist leanings. This happened quite a few times. And so maybe this is sort of the background where Edwina's sympathies came from. In terms of sympathies for communism, and there was also something about Louis Mountbatten himself, because one of his ancestors had broken the rules. He married outside of the rules, and they had to lose the name, the noble house of Hessen. So they had to pick a name. They picked Battenberg, and they turned into Mountbatten. And so there was this attempt to sideline Louis Mountbatten, because those were the rules. If you were part of a family that old, if you broke the rules, you had to be sidelined, right? But somehow Mountbatten wormed his way back in. He rose up, probably had some weird help to do so. And so he was an insider, but he was also an outsider. Many people in high places didn't like him. And so when you have this marriage between those two, they felt mistreated. They felt different. And so this is something that the communists may use to gain trust, to get a foot in the door, so to speak. This was a very, very important, very, very important chapter in history, and I have some more notes on that when it comes to the Chinese War and the Korean War and these other people that were involved.
So what did again, my question, what did Mountbatten do to help Mao come to power in China? Did he do anything?
Well, as you mentioned, the whole Burma affair, that played a role when he sort of
Did Britain give any military aid to Chiang Kai-shek, or was it cut off with the Americans making the deal with Marshall making the deal with the communists?
I think it was more about sharing of information, sharing of intelligence, because this was sort of the trump card that Mountbatten had, really. So, for example, when we look at the Burma campaign, if you become the Supreme Allied Commander of Southeast Asia Command, what intelligence do you not have access to, really? And as we've seen, he tried to impress Stalin to a large degree. And also we heard about the tensions between General Stilwell and Mountbatten, of course. And when we talk about Stilwell, there was a very, very strange handover of command. This was hang on a second, I'm trying to find this in my notes here. this was a handover of power in the Eastern Theater, and normally you would expect a proper introduction of the new leadership, and you hand over all the information, but that really didn't happen. So here, for example, so Stilwell had the backing of the U.S. president, and Stilwell had a large degree of control over the forces of the Chinese nationalists. So everybody thought this should be doable. The Americans can outproduce the Russians. We should have this in the bag, right? But then came this interference, and this handover. This was Stilwell and Wedemeyer, right? So
Yeah, I'm glad you
Japan,
mentioned Wiedemeyer because he was Mountbatten's chief of staff, I think, and then he took over for Stilwell. And he wrote Wiedemeyer reports. He wrote a very important book. He seemed to understand the danger of communism and enunciated it. And although he would, for example, contradict Senator Joseph McCarthy's accusations against Marshall, he was loyal to Marshall. He seemed to be, of all those people, he seemed to be at least have a level head and understand the situation in China. Would you agree?
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, it's here in my notes. In 1943, Wedemeyer became chief of staff under Louis Mountbatten for the Allied forces in Southeast Asia.
Yeah, and he had a more sensible. He was involved also in planning when the United States was looking at having to build a two-ocean navy to defend against a victorious Japan and Germany. He was involved in that strategizing, and of course knew what a difficult position America would have been in if the Axis had won the war. So he was a guy who understood that America needed to be in the war and needed to make the war come out in a way that served American interest, not Soviet or communist interests. So he was kind of unlike Stilwell, unlike Mountbatten, and of course involved with those. But he wasn't a guy, he was very guarded in his criticisms, let us say, of his colleagues, Stilwell. Although I think in private, he had a lot to say about Stilwell, and because he had to clean up Stilwell's mess when he took over for him in 1944 in China. People don't realize the United States had two air forces operating in China during World War II. I think it was the 14th under Chennault, and I think the other one was the 12th. No, the 20th. I'm sorry. That is really quite an armed commitment. Of course, the Air Force was under the Army. In World War II, we didn't have an independent Air Force. It was the U.S. Army Air Force. And Stilwell was an Army general. So that was important. And, the original plan, military plan, was that the U.S. would invade Taiwan and land in China with forces. And Admiral Nimitz canceled this. And so we did, I think there were some landings on the Chinese coast, but the U.S. ground forces in China were rather limited. And so our ability to interfere, there was a possibility at one point where we could have intervened militarily in the Chinese Civil War by sending more troops, but we did not do this. And this will come back to haunt the U.S. later in the arguments between Truman and MacArthur over Korea and the role that the Chinese nationalists should play in that war. That will also come up.
So General Wedemeyer, the successor of General Joseph Stilwell, in the position of Chief of Staff of Chiang Kai-shek and the commando of Southeast Asia, normally you would have a orderly handover of the command, and you would explain all sorts of things. But Stilwell basically just left and almost did not give anything to Wedemeyer. And so they were asking around the staff members, and they were shrugging their shoulders, and they said, well, Stilwell always kept anything important in his hip pocket. He was keeping everything very close to himself. So I'm going to read that specific book that I mentioned earlier, I'm gonna read this book, Stilwell and Mountbatten in Burma, Allies at War, 1943 to 1944, because this is incredibly strange. So a lot of distrust, and of course, at the time, and this is in the descriptions in in the literature, at the time there was a cultural difference between the Americans and the British. So the Americans, they called the British the Limeys, and they found that the British, they had a weird accent. They were still behaving like a colonial force. This was all very very weird and traditional. And of course, America had America having gained independence, and now you have to work with the British, and the British, they still sound and act like they did all those years back, right? So this is sort of a weird situation if you have to work with these British. And on December 7th of 1945, Wedemeyer had a meeting with General Douglas MacArthur and Navy Admiral Raymond A. Spruance, and so they came up with this plan to threaten the communists with moving nationalist troops north and even into Manchuria. And so this was supposed to convince the communists to have to come to terms with the nationalists, to have this communist nationalist alliance. And Stilwell was suggesting using Lend-Lease assets, using these assets for the nationalists and the communists to fight the Japanese. And this, of course, horrified Chiang Kai-shek, and so Stilwell really didn't like the British. He really didn't trust the British, and so Stilwell was one of the guys calling the Brits the Limeys, and they were still into this old imperialist style, and these animosities and this distrust was later used as an excuse why China was lost to the communists. This was all kind of pinned on certain people. But as we know from this recent book, there was all sorts of narratives that were shaped, blaming this person, blaming that person, just drawing attention away from the communist infiltration of Mountbatten.
And to draw them away from the communist infiltration in Washington that was influencing policy. You had all these people, they would criticize Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists because they won't fight the Japanese. They're not true allies. Mao's fighting the Japanese, which wasn't true either. But because there was this underlying Chinese Civil War waiting to break out as soon as Japan was defeated, and Japan was going to be defeated by the United States. The Chinese all knew that, both the communists and the nationalists. So why would the communists or the nationalists expend their troops, waste their supplies and resources attacking the Japanese when they knew the Japanese were going to surrender anyway, and they would just be weakening themselves for the ultimate confrontation with each other? And this is one of the things that Stilwell and even Wedemeyer didn't understand fully. Wedemeyer got the nationalists to attack more, got more supplies for them, increased the flights over the Himalayas. They called it the hump, the flying over the hump, to get Chiang. I'm going to give you more supplies, attack some more. But Chiang had to be careful that he didn't exhaust his supplies. That he would do this attack and the Americans wouldn't give him sufficient supplies in case the war ended and he had to confront the Chinese communists, right? Yeah. So in this we see the supply, the dependency of countries like Ukraine or South Vietnam dependent on American supplies and support. This is a problem for our allies. Do they trust us when they see somebody like Marshall or someone like Mountbatten who is interested in currying favor with Stalin or with the Russians or the Chinese communists, having some kind of authority over their lifeline? This can make these people crazy.
We can see the same kind of monkeying around with Ukraine these days when some people suggest, well, shouldn't we just divide Ukraine? So the Russians get one part and the other side gets the other part of Ukraine. Shouldn't we come to terms, blah, blah, blah. It's the same stuff that went on in China, when all these ideas were floated around. Couldn't we have like a communist China and a nationalist China? This was just this monkeying around, and the ultimate result was all of China was lost. There were 3 divisions of Chinese nationalists, 3 whole divisions, American equipped, and these divisions defected to the communists. And this is when U.S. President Truman, started to cut the weapons deliveries. And after this all went down, General Wedemeyer had to testify in front of the U.S. Congress. And of course, he said that the nationalists lost because they didn't get more supplies. The nationalists couldn't win without these American supplies. This is not rocket science.
You can't, China, just think about it. Manchuria, it is true. The Soviet army withdrew from Manchuria. And briefly, because of the threat from the Americans that you were talking about, the communists sort of pretended that they were allowing Manchuria to become, part of nationalist China, a part of the whole, as part of their negotiation. And it was very tortured and took place over a long period of time. But the Chinese, during all these peace talks, they were subverting. They were not only making a better impression by their lying and their false behavior in front of Marshall, but they were also infiltrating the nationalists, and they were spreading demoralization. And if you feel your side is being undermined by the British and Americans while you're trying to fight the communists, you can understand why generals would defect. They're going, these guys are the winning side, right?
Yeah.
Marshall likes Mao better than he likes Chiang. And Mountbatten's not really a friend of the nationalists. So you can see how that would be. I mean, would that be accurate, would you say?
Yeah. I mean, there were these other military officers that had to testify in front of Congress committee, because the big question was, who lost China? That became the slogan. How did this go so wrong? And you had people like Vice Admiral Oscar C. Badger, General Claire Chennault, and Brigadier General Francis Brink. They all testified, of course, this was lost because we didn't send them weapons and ammo and trucks and planes and stuff. What else?
we sent everything to Stalin.
Yeah, and so this was sort of the suffocation, the slow suffocation of these nationalist troops. And Mao was fighting a war, of course, with Soviet-Russian training, all these important Chinese people that were all Russian trained and vetted again. And so this whole Russian-Soviet style of warfare, that was then transferred to the Chinese. So they kept starving cities. They kept just brutalizing these large cities in China. Trying to win over the countryside population and just forcing this program ahead. There was such a close relationship between Russia and China. Some observers at the time, they were joking that this was more like a Russian takeover of China, or more like a Russian revolution in China, because of that level of training that was provided, the money, the equipment. And we saw some, political cleansing operations within the Chinese communists. This happened over and over again when they started, when they came to be more successful, when they were starting to take over. It was always about the loyalty to Russia. There was never anything tolerated where people thought, on the Chinese communist side, well, we're going to take over China and then we'll be our own thing and we'll just, have a relationship with the Russians. No, you had to have absolute loyalty to Stalin. And even though they had this whole theater of not liking each other, letting Mao sit in this, or not treating Mao so well when he came to visit and all that theatrics, almost nobody was more Stalinist than Mao. This was a very large operation. And once Mao was in power, you had an influx of Soviet advisors. That means handlers. You saw Soviet media becoming Chinese media. You saw all these Soviet portraits hanging everywhere in China. This was a takeover that didn't even change anything from the older communist revolution in Russia, because people understood the problems of the forced collectivization and the gulags and just the time frame they had set for themselves. So everybody thought, well, they may do it in a more elegant way in China, but they didn't. They had the same reset button pushed to force everybody into this new cult. So people were even changing their style of clothing. You know, China was a very loud place, a very colorful place, especially in the cities. People who were well off or better off, they liked fashion. They were wearing all these clothings and hairstyles. But when the communists took over in China, everybody was wearing the same style of crappy clothing. Nobody wanted to have that. Just nobody wanted to seem alive. Nobody wanted to have fun. Nobody wanted to draw attention to himself. Nobody was more Stalinist than Mao. Yet to this day, you just cannot get it into people's heads nowadays. In America and Europe, that Russia and China are really that close, and you see the Russian Soviet style everywhere in China. It's just their style. They didn't
Well,
change anything.
they initially called China Soviet China when it,
Right.
and then Red China. It's interesting. There's a report that General Marshall was given, an intelligence report dated April 12th, 1945, about this issue of Asia. And I'll just read an excerpt from it. The entry of Soviet Russia into the Asiatic War, what we call the War in the Pacific, would be a political event of world-shaking importance, the ill effect of which would be felt for decades to come. Its military significance at this stage of the war would be relatively unimportant. The entry of Soviet Russia into the Asiatic War would destroy America's position in Asia quite as effectively as our position is now destroyed in Europe, east of the Elbe and beyond the Adriatic. So this report basically was saying when Russia enters that war, we're going to lose our position in Asia because they're going to start to leverage all their assets in that part of the world. And basically, we lost China. We lost North Korea. We could have lost the whole of Korea. We lost Indochina ultimately. So the Asian mainland is from the Arctic all the way down to the tropics is communist in Asia, the Asian mainland. Siberia all the way down to the tip of Vietnam.
Yeah.
All the way down. It's communist, and it's communist to this day. For those who understand that the government in Moscow is still adhering to Marxism, Leninism behind the scenes. So these events that took place in the late 1940s were very key, and this was if Yalta Agreement that gave away Europe from the Elbe, east, gave away Europe to Moscow, was orchestrated by Alger Hiss and Andrei Gromyko, the then later to become Soviet foreign minister. How would we say the Pacific and Asia was orchestrated? It was Marshall, and it was Mountbatten, and it was Mao Zedong.
Yeah.
Basically made it what it was. Whether Marshall was it's very controversial to say whether Marshall was a Soviet agent or he was under some kind of obligation that we don't know, because Harry Hopkins made Marshall's career. He would have been a nobody without Harry Hopkins. And it's believed by really smart people that Hopkins was a Soviet agent, Agent 19. We don't have absolute proof of this because they weren't among the agents that were absolutely caught red-handed like Alger Hiss and Harry Dexter White.
I think a complication in this is, or an interesting angle into this is, when we look at these key American players of that time in that sphere, some of these American players were tied to the Skull and Bones organization. Now, there is a suspicion that Mountbatten's larger family, this aristocratic cluster of families, that Mountbatten's people had some sort of a backdoor into Skull and Bones, the organization in America, which became influential in intelligence and banking and the military.
I mean, Skull and Bones is a fraternity at Yale.
And
basically.
it became
It's a frat boy thing at Yale.
well, it was financed with money that came from, or was money that was gathered through the British East India Company or some other opium selling, and there's distinctive British roots to Skull and
But
Bones.
it's
And
also
when
there's German roots to Skull and Bones.
oh yeah, oh yeah, and
I
when we
mean,
talk
it
Germany,
really
yeah,
is. Yeah.
and when we talk older German roots, that goes into the aristocracy as well. So we have a significant problem once the communists infiltrate the aristocracy, because the aristocracy has, networks in all kinds of strange places. And I think that some of these assets that used to be, well, clandestine British assets on American soil, some of these assets were possibly loaned to the communists because Mountbatten was trying to save himself, and Mountbatten was trying to save his family because the communists had the goods on him. They knew
And by the
stuff.
way, that's an interesting thing you just said, because Wild Bill Donovan, the head of the OSS, the American Wartime Intelligence Agency that preceded the CIA, was, according to some biographers of Donovan, was recruited as a British agent during World War One,
Oh, oh,
and of course was later cooperated with the communists when he was head of the OSS. Had many communists in the OSS, so that your point could go to be made through Donovan's biography, although it's all very murky and we don't really know for sure all the details.
yeah. I mean, of course, after the American Revolution, American independence, there was a working relationship, not a steady working relationship between the United States and Britain. But I highly suspect that the British would not let this go. I mean, during the War of Independence, the British thought they had bigger fish to fry, meaning the arch enemy France, right? So this was a larger war. The British had to control their territories. They had to fight the French in different parts of the world. So the decision in Britain was made to end the military and to end the war against the American rebels, right? But what about the intelligence war? Would the British have stopped their intelligence war against the Americans? I think not. I think the British continued their intelligence war against the Americans indefinitely. And when you have some of these networks, spy rings in America that led by the British, these networks could be developed, the universities and stuff like that. So I think there's at least a British backdoor into Skull and Bones. And once the British have an infiltration problem, with the communists, this is the point, I think, where British networks in America may be loaned to the communists without the American assets even knowing about it. Because if you just do normal business, you relay intelligence, to your contacts, and then that intelligence finds its way to Britain like it's always been done. What happens if there's a breach in Britain? What happens if there's, a serious breach in Britain? The American assets wouldn't even know about it. And, it was not just Mountbatten, because through his actions and his bumbling, sending Anthony Blunt to collect the incriminating data from Germany, through Mountbatten, this larger British system got compromised. And also there was the inclination of, let's keep the aristocracy relevant. We want to stay relevant by aligning sort of with the communists. And it's a very dangerous thing.
Well, yeah, I should note, I wouldn't overestimate British spying on America because everybody had agents. Most famously, I don't know if you know this or not, James Wilkinson, General James Wilkinson, who was the senior leader in the U.S. military and the U.S. Army through 4 presidential administrations, was famously discovered later he was a Spanish spy,
Oh, no.
a spy of the Empire of Spain, of all things. So it isn't just so simple that the British had these influential people in U.S. And of course, who were they? It's America is kind of like an open book, and that if you can buy somebody who's important, you can you can have agents in the U.S. There was a book written, I have it, about General James Wilkinson, which is rather remarkable because being a spy, being the top American military official through presidents. I mean, he was a senior officer under Washington, Adams, Jefferson, and Madison. That's through the War of 1812, and he was a Spanish spy.
Oh no.
What was the significance of that?
Well,
It's
of course,
hard to
I mean,
say. Yeah.
the Spanish. I mean, at some point with the what was it, the War of Succession or something. At some point, the Spanish and the House of Habsburg, they had ambitions. I mean, for a long time,
Mhm.
they had ambitions in North America. And at some point, there was a grave danger to the 13 American colonies because you had this huge territory in North America controlled by France and also huge territories controlled by Spain. And if you had this sort of, if these interests of the French and the Spanish had aligned, that would have been incredibly dangerous to the American colonies or the British colonies on American soil.
Yeah, and
So,
Wilkinson was known, by the way, as Agent 13. That was
age 13, right?
that was the code
Yeah.
used for him. So no, America's always had this problem of uh, generals potentially being captured by a foreign agents. And this is the thing that was so incredible when in 1950, after this disaster of 1949, where Russia got the bomb and the Chinese Civil War, and in 1950, on June 30th, communist North Korea then invaded the South, which is what we
Mm-hmm.
have to talk about next. This invasion of this disaster led Senator Joseph McCarthy to examine Marshall's background, and a fellow senator told him, "Don't attack Marshall. He's a
Hmm.
hero to the American people. You'll sound like a nut. They'll think you're just attacking this
Wasn't he more
guy."
popular than the president at times?
Marshall was very popular as the top general during the war. So he was like the general above all the generals. He was the boss of Douglas MacArthur and the
Hmm.
boss of Patton and Bradley and so on. And he was, as because the Army controlled the air forces, it wasn't just all of the American armies operating in the Pacific and the European theater, but all the air forces as well were under him. So this is a tremendous power that Marshall had gotten. And of course, Marshall was given his job because of the machinations of Harry Hopkins, the co-president, famously accused of being Agent 19,
Yeah.
by Marx, a researcher who examined some of the conferences to determine who Agent 19 from the Venona decrypts might have been. So, and there's a lot of things that Hopkins did that I mentioned before. So you had and you had Harry Dexter White in the Treasury. We know he was a Soviet agent. There's no doubt of that. We had Elger Hiss in the State Department. We had, because when you have these in the late 40s, you have these congressional testimony. You had two of the main couriers for the Russian spy rings in Washington were Elizabeth Bentley and Whittaker Chambers. And they broke with their communist and Soviet masters, and they testified. Chambers famously testified against Elger Hiss, and Bentley testified about a number of things. And their testimonies, by the way, of Bentley and Chambers overlapped, which
Right.
caused indictments, grand juries to form. And initially, now this is scary, President Truman wanted Chambers to be prosecuted. He wanted the FBI to
Hmm.
investigate Chambers and prosecute him, not Hiss, because he had accused Elder Hiss, who was almost certainly a Soviet agent. I think there's no doubt about that, because Hiss perjured himself
Throwing
and
off the
claimed that he
scent.
did
Yeah.
not know Whittaker Chambers,
Mm-hmm.
and then it was proved that he did. And of course, espionage is a difficult charge to prove. So Whittaker Chambers went to prison for perjury, actually,
Mm-hmm.
for perjuring himself. But why did he perjure himself if he was innocent?
What do you
He
think
wasn't.
about Dean Acheson in the U.S. State Department making public statements that some people interpreted as the United States not having an interest in Korea. What would going to
Well,
be
Dean
happening to
Acheson
Korea?
was Secretary of State then under Truman. And the Cold War was just started to beginning, and the whole idea of containment was just sort of um, being formulated, right? Of what do we do about the Soviet Union? There's a communist, we didn't mention, there's a attempt for the communists to take over Greece. There was the Soviet armies had to be pushed out of Iran, but we basically kind of made an agreement with them to get out of what was then Persia. Uh, there was, of course, the problems along the east-west line in Europe, and of course, the Korean War broke out. But what what was really problematic with Acheson was that they somehow did not. The U.S. State Department did not say that we would defend South Korea. It was not included within our containment line, shall we say.
Right.
It was omitted. Now, was that a mistake? Or was because the State Department was seriously compromised and infiltrated
Hmm.
by the communists? And I should mention the State Department. There was a Natalie Grant Raga worked for the State Department in Latvia in Riga, and she had gathered the most incredible archives. She was a Russian who married an American diplomat, got out of the Soviet Union, and she just was passionate and well organized. And she developed this, you could call it a data bank of data on how, in fact, she was the one who figured out the trust was, one of the first
Right.
people that realized the trust was phony. And she recorded the early approaches of the trust because I think the first trust representative appeared in Riga. I think, if my memory serving me, talking about how these monarchists had taken over the Soviet Union from the inside. And so she understood the methods that the communists used and the Soviets used. And there was within the State Department then formed this group of anti-communists who really understood Russia, had formed this brain in the State Department that archived all these materials about Soviet deception and policies and what they were really up to. And unfortunately, Roosevelt's minions who got into the State Department in the Roosevelt administration forcibly destroyed that whole archive, eliminated it completely, and then pushed the people who were involved with it out of the State Department.
Oh boy.
And this happened, and of course, it happened again in the CIA when Angleton formed the same thing in the CIA counterintelligence staff in 1954, began
Getting
to form the
serious, yeah.
same thing.
Yeah.
And by 1974, when he gets pushed out of the CIA, when Seymour Hersh publishes things about him that were probably leaked to him by the head of the CIA, William Colby, that part is destroyed, and the CIA then is brainless. It has no memory. It has no knowledge anymore of Soviet methods, and so you had this situation. So Acheson comes along, and there's lots of people around Acheson. It's very hard to say that Acheson's a Soviet agent. But you've got him in the State Department. They're formulating policy. There's good people and there's bad people.
He at least he could have made a clearer statement, maybe an indication that we would not just let Korea hang, because you just mentioned before, China was lost, Asia was mostly communist. The Americans had control of the Philippines. There was Japan, who was still mad at the Americans, but
the French at that point, the French still controlled Indochina.
Right.
Ho was just a little rebel at that point, but yeah, they had gotten control of China, which was huge, of course, and the Soviet Union was there. But the real difficulty with, there were people in the State Department who were formulating containment and opposing the Soviet Union. But how much disinformation? So did somebody who was an agent of the Soviets make sure that South Korea was left out of the statement? Was that finessed in some way? Because they knew because Stalin knew he was going to invade. See, let's talk about Korea for a second. North Korea was put under command of a Soviet military officer named Kim Il-sung. Kim Il Sung was Korean, but he was a Soviet military officer,
And
and Stalin
he
sent him
barely
from
spoke, yeah,
Moscow.
and he barely spoke Korean because he was running with the Chinese militants for so long. This was
Well,
when,
he was in Moscow. He was
yeah,
actually a Soviet military officer when he was sent to take control of North Korea by Stalin. And of course, this was when Korea was partitioned. The Soviet forces that invaded Manchuria had come down into North Korea, and so they partitioned the country. So the Russians wanted to make sure there wasn't an American reaction. So if the Secretary of State Atchison could be tricked into not putting Korea on this list of the frontline states to be defended, then the invasion, they'd go, oh, well, it's not on our list. Let Stalin have it. So what Stalin had done is he built up this North Korean army with T-34 tanks and as much good equipment as they could to do this sudden invasion of the South. Just a sudden, and it was in the dry season. It was at the end of June 30th, 1950. And of course, and it was very Truman made this was of course had been offended by Stalin. He saw Stalin as breaking all the agreements that he had made with Roosevelt. In fact, Stalin had called Molotov to see him. Molotov was the Soviet foreign minister, and said, "Mr. Molotov, your boss is a liar. Basically, you've broken your agreements with us." And of course, this is the beginning of the Cold War. This is when, Truman has finally had enough. He's not going to tolerate any
right.
more of this. And you had the Berlin blockade. Maybe you want to talk about that, when the Russians tried to cut West Berlin off. Did you want to make a comment on that?
Well,
Being German?
the airdrops. I mean, you had to supply the the other part of Berlin. You had to supply it by air, and this was a major crisis. And also, the communists had this bunker system along the border. They created these command bunkers along the German border for an invasion army. So they would actually run this operation from these bunkers, and they had new equipment installed all the time. At some point, they had it computerized, and this was sort of a wake up call, I think, to many, because if you lose Germany, then the Red Army is right in the middle of Europe, then you lose probably Europe as well. And where's the end of this? And this is kind of the same situation that happened again and again in the Cold War, when the Americans intervened, but the Soviet propaganda went into overdrive, accusing the Americans of imperialism, as if the Americans had this vested interest to just control Korea for control's sake, that far away from home, actually. But this was at some point a statement had to be made, and Korea was almost lost. I mean, the Americans and the South Koreans, they were almost pushed back into the ocean.
Yeah, it was a blitzkrieg. I should mention about the Berlin blockade is in June 1948, just to give the time frame. The Russians just cut all the roads going to West Berlin, thinking that they could get all of Berlin. They didn't want this island of Western control inside their East Germany. And of course, the airlift prevented it from falling. And there was another crisis again when Kennedy became president. But getting to Korea, yeah, the initial, because they had good tanks at the time, well, T-34s were pretty good, because the South Korean army really didn't have armor. The North Koreans were able to break through and push them back, and Truman decided to intervene, so he sent the 1st Marine Division. And I knew when I was younger, when I was in college, I met guys that were in the Marines that had fought those early battles. The Marines came in, and they were holding out at the very bottom of the Korean Peninsula. There's this little bubble where the Republic of Korean Army and the Marines were just barely holding on down there. And that was in this one colonel that I met when I was a freshman in college. He was in a class on this that I was in. There were 2 veterans of the Korean War in the class. And he talked to the class, the professor had him talk to the class about how a lot of his friends, his buddies in the Marines, they were thrown into this battle so badly outnumbered that they were just dying like flies. They were because they were just trying to hold this line. And Douglas MacArthur, who was basically governing Japan at the time, it was the conqueror of Japan, ostensibly, became the commander, and he conceived of this bold amphibious landing behind the North Korean lines at Incheon. So as we're just barely holding on down there, this large American landing on the coast behind the North Korean line was engineered. It was a very risky operation because of the way the tides worked, but it was a success. And this flanking of the North Koreans caused the routing of the North Korean army, which then caused the North Korean army then to be holding out in the far north of Korea in little enclaves with their backs to the Yalu River into China, with the Chinese supplying them. So the situation in Korea was reversed by this brilliant move by General MacArthur of this landing at Incheon. And that's where we get, when we get to November 1950, this is where we get to the appearance on the Chinese border of the Japanese volunteer army, 250,000, the Chinese volunteer army, the 250,000 Chinese troops that were sent. Of course, volunteer is just the name. I don't think any of these soldiers volunteered.
In the freezing cold, by the way, with insufficient equipment.
And North Korea is that area of the world, that's Manchuria, North Korea, part of China and Korea, that is a very cold in the winter and late fall. And of course, Douglas MacArthur made a mistake. He didn't think, because of the equipment of the Chinese army, and because the gap where they could have come through, there were no roads. So how could an army attack across terrain that had no roads? How could they be supplied? So the Western generals, not thinking in a Chinese way, not realizing how the Chinese and the communists and the Soviets would have done this too, they had no regard for supply lines, had no regard for the niceties of war that we respect, like feeding your soldiers and making them warm, that they would actually send 250,000 soldiers through this area, basically break the lines and the U.S. was fighting under NATO command technically, and there were Greek and Australian and Turkish troops fighting as well. Mm-hmm. There was a lot of nations sent contingents to fight in the Korean War. The largest, of course, was the American Army and Marine Corps. And this just shattered, this offensive of the Chinese volunteer army just shattered the American line, the UN line. And there's a story for those of you, how did we get to be fighting under the UN? Here's a funny story. The Russians staged a protest against what we were doing in the UN over this Korea thing, and the Russian delegation walked out of the UN, and then they voted, the UN voted to defend South Korea, right? So this was the case of it being UN troops, because there was no Soviet there to execute a veto in the Security Council. Yeah. So over what happened. So that's how that happened. Of course, it's very peculiar because the Soviet general ran the military part of the UN. So technically, the whole UN operation was under a Soviet general. Technically, of course, they didn't really command anything, but this becomes one of those weird things. But yeah, so the U.S. forces broke. The Marines got isolated and had to march out under these terrible winter conditions. Well, it was winter-like conditions. Had to march in the Battle of Chosin Reservoir. Had to escape. And of course, it was terrible disasters occurred in the U.S. Army, U.S. 2nd Division. They had their logistical troops were unprotected, and the Chinese would overrun the truck convoys, capture all the supplies. And of course, the Chinese were living off of captured stuff because they didn't have a supply line, And the Chinese, and actually the Chinese were able to make it all the way to Seoul and capture the capital of South Korea. To go all the way back. Of course, the line kind of locked up there. And this is where people started criticizing MacArthur. And MacArthur, to polish up his image, because MacArthur was very image crazy, started criticizing the administration and the division, his superiors like Omar Bradley back in Washington. And of course, the new Secretary of Defense was George Marshall, who
Hmm.
went from being Secretary of State then of the Marshall Plan to Secretary of Defense. Um, and so MacArthur then, his criticisms, his barbed criticisms of the administration and the higher ups in Washington, they weren't going to sit still for it. So
Yeah,
this is how MacArthur got fired by Truman, which was, it enraged a lot of Americans. It was very controversial firing of MacArthur.
because he was so popular.
He
Uh,
was very popular. And of course, MacArthur's complaint was, I can't bomb half a bridge. They're restricting my
yeah,
ability. Here, the North
why
Koreans were being
can't we
supplied by the
win?
Chinese, right?
Yeah.
And he wasn't allowed to go in and destroy those areas with bombing raids to make it so that he could be safe. So he claimed that his defeat by the Chinese Volunteer Army was really inflicted on him by Washington.
So I have this in my notes here. MacArthur ordered Lieutenant General Stratemeyer to destroy 6 bridges over the Yalu River, which the Chinese had used to get into Korea. But Defense Secretary George C. Marshall just changed or eliminated that order. And
Yep.
Stratemeyer was later testifying, we were ordered to lose the war. We were not allowed to win. I mean, what?
Yeah. Yeah. No, that is the kind of thing you were having testimony. And of course, Marshall retired from politics. He left the Defense Department in 1951 in the wake of all this. And he complained it was reasons of health, and it might have been reasons of health, but then it might have been that he kind of, he had used up his political capital by then. And the really the criticisms of him, McCarthy's criticisms, although people like Wiedemeyer defended Marshall, people like Eisenhower defended Marshall, um, McCarthy had become so popular that when Eisenhower was running for president, he didn't dare criticize
Hmm,
McCarthy during the election. It was afterwards that
interesting.
he worked to undermine McCarthy. But because these army guys who had come up under um, a Marshall were very, let us say, they were very threatened and they were very angry about McCarthy and about the investigations of what had gone on in World War II and the kind of coordination with the Soviets that had led to the fall of China and to the Korean War. A Korean War where more than 50,000 Americans were killed
Yeah.
in the fighting. I mean,
Uh,
it wasn't a nothing, you know.
was very serious. In on January 1st, 1951, 400,000 Chinese and 100,000 North Korean troops started an offensive against the 200,000 troops of the United Nations forces. And so this, of course, shifted the dynamics of the war. And MacArthur suggested to use some nuclear weapons against Chinese cities and to start a naval blockade. This was vetoed or just not considered by the Truman government. Now, of course,
Yeah, in
uh,
fact, Marshall's advice to Truman, and this is important to note, that what Marshall did is Marshall said, we can't have another world war. We have to prevent. Marshall's rhetoric to within Washington was, the objective was to prevent World War III from breaking out in 1950 and 51. And so therefore, he was going to deny everything that Douglas MacArthur wanted and everything that was necessary to win. So for the first time, you had an American army that was confronting two communist armies, the North Korean and the
yeah,
Chinese armies. Um, the general was not given what he needed, and of course the American air power was absolute. You know, there was
yeah,
no contesting the air, but yet they can, and this is astonishing. How can a modern army with air superiority be driven back?
yeah,
Well, look at the numbers. You just said 600,000 troops against 200,000
200,000.
troops. You know, that's a 3-to-1 ratio on the ground. And so literally they weren't able to make a continuous line to keep all those troops out. And the Chinese used human wave tactics. If you've ever talked to, I knew a number of, I lived next door to a Korean veteran who was left for dead at Incheon. He was a corpsman. He lived next door to me when I was in college. And he was one of only two corpsmen that survived in the First Marine Division from those battles. And is quite a tough guy. He walked out in the cold himself, wounded. He got out. I mean, that's quite a story. I knew another guy who was with the 7th U.S. Regiment. He was the regimental surgeon of the regiment. He wrote a book called Bloody Snow. Robert, I'm trying to remember his last name. He related the Chinese wave attacks, how they were surrounded. They were trying to march back to American lines in a sea of Chinese troops. So this was, and units like the Turkish regiment was completely captured and taken prisoner. For example, some whole regiments were overrun by the Chinese, and a lot of Americans were taken prisoner in that battle. So it was a humiliating defeat, and people don't. Right now the Chinese have made a movie about it. I haven't seen it. China's made a movie about it, a war movie showing the glorious volunteer army. I'm sure they're removing the parts about how their soldiers were freezing to death. Korean veterans would say how they'd be warming themselves at a fire, and the shadowy figures on the edge were warming themselves, and they were Chinese troops. They don't shoot me. I'm coming to be warm. That's how crazy it was. And you've got, Chesty Puller ended up being commander of the 1st Marine Division very famously. If people read his biography, he writes about how he managed the battle, how he managed to get the division out. The Marines were able to fight their way out, it's an amazing story that a division that's completely surrounded and cut off can actually fight its way off. And Chesty Puller famously, they said, well, you're surrounded. He says, good. In any direction I shoot, I'm killing the enemy. Was his attitude. Puller had been a famous Marine regimental commander in the Second World War at Guadalcanal. He was personally responsible for stopping the Japanese offensive that could have broken our army at Guadalcanal, and he was at Peleliu. Those were the battles that he was famously at in World War II. But he was a big factor in the Korean War. Maybe the most famous Marine general of all, Chesty Puller. But yeah, so the Korean War was a real war. But not with the intention to win. And so this became, you get 1951, 52, where the line is sort of locking up. The Koreans, the Truman administration would have liked to have been able to make peace, but the North Koreans and the Chinese and the Soviets, when by that time the Soviets are flying fighter planes in, trying to interfere with the U.S. Air Force. So there's dogfighting happening between U.S. and Soviet airmen. And what made this possible? The bomb, the Soviets having the bomb, and the Chinese being communist made this war doable, potentially winnable. And of course, then so you get the 1952 presidential election, where you have the general Eisenhower gets nominated as the Republican candidate for president, and Eisenhower is not really a conservative; he's really a liberal. I think he was a registered Democrat previously, if I'm not mistaken. But he's going to run against Truman. And of course, Truman by this time is somewhat discredited because people aren't happy about the war. They're not happy about the loss of China. They're not happy about the Soviet Union getting the bomb. So Eisenhower gets elected. And what is Eisenhower's plan in the Korean War? Eisenhower, and this came out, John Lewis Gaddis wrote the book, The Long Peace, where you had the Eisenhower archive, the secret minutes of national security meetings coming out. And Gaddis wrote this really excellent history. He's a left of center historian, but he's a very good one, showing that Eisenhower, they did a study, the Army did a study on what if we widened the war to China? What if we went into China and widened the war and just took on the Soviets and said, "Look, you're not going to give us peace in Korea. We're just going to take you out. If we want World War III now, we'll give it to you." So this is what the study determined. The study determined that countries like Britain, where you have Lord Mountbatten and Attlee, at least in
Hmm.
1951, in power, would not be reliable. Of course, Churchill came to power back to power in 1951, but France would not be reliable. West Germany would not be reliable. This is what the study did. The United States, maybe with the British, would have to go it alone pretty much against the Soviets and
Yeah.
Chinese. The war would take 10 years to win. It would cost 10 million American lives, but we would prevail. That was what the study showed,
10 million.
which is fascinating. It's terrifying. And maybe my guess is that that's exaggerated. I don't think it
Hmm.
was going to take 10 years, and I don't think it would cost 10 million. I think that was exaggerated because Marshall wanted it exaggerated, right?
Right.
But Eisenhower came in and he said, I'm not messing around. I'm going to widen the war. And so when he was inaugurated, it was all about the plans, filling submarines with anthrax. He said, we don't need to use nukes on the
Hmm.
Chinese because there's too many of them and they're not an urban country anywhere. They're all their
Spread
population is in the
around. Yeah.
peasantry. So they were going to release anthrax into the coastal air that would be carried inland at night, and that was the plan. And they were going to move bombers, strategic bombers with nukes, to Japan in preparation for this. Well, you can bet as soon as they heard about this in Moscow, there was panic,
Hmm.
right? Well, Stalin is in, and this is where we get to this story about Stalin being overthrown. Stalin wanted the war.
Yeah.
He wanted to have a war. He was old. He figured it would unify, it would get rid of the people. He wanted to purge the people around him again. They'd become too comfortable. His system was based on purging the people around him to keep them responsible. And so he was planning another purge. He'd already started the doctor's plot. And in March of 1953, this is just weeks after Eisenhower comes in and says, I'm not going to mess around. He was basically not going to give in Korea. Stalin wasn't.
Hmm.
And so it was up to Khrushchev, and Beria, the head of the security services in Khrushchev, basically plotted to eliminate Stalin, according to um, Stalin's bodyguards, who said that Khrushchev relieved them on the night Stalin died.
Yeah.
So did Stalin really have a stroke? His bodyguards had been eliminated. What was going on? The speculation is that he was poisoned, um, and so it seems that, and a number of biographers have noticed certain suspicious things about the Stalin death story. And of course, what did they do? They started negotiating in earnest with the Americans. And so by the time you get to the summer, late spring and summer, they've got a deal practically hammered out for ending an armistice. It wasn't the Korean War technically still going on. It's just an armistice that's lasted, 74 years or 70, 71 years. So this armistice, which is still in effect, with the DMZ still there, the demilitarized zone still there, is where it's been left off. But this was this war shaped containment policy, shaped the U.S. military, and under Eisenhower, and also starting under Truman, but especially under Eisenhower, there was a military buildup. And under Eisenhower, the policy wasn't mutual assured destruction. It was overwhelming,
Yeah.
just destruction of any enemy, that we would just destroy whoever attacked us. And so this began America's, and of course NATO came into existence in this period. What NATO had come into existence? What year do you remember?
I don't remember
Was it
exactly.
49?
Something like that. Yeah. This was.
But they weren't really fully, properly organized and consolidated really until the 50s. And this is when we get into what happens in the 50s then. Of course, there's pushes in other areas by the communists. You have the war in Indochina, which is managed initially by the French, and the Algerian War, which we should get into next week. But these were anti-imperialist wars, right? National
Hmm.
liberation
Hmm.
struggles, where the French Empire was taken down, basically, in these two wars. And the French Fourth Republic fell, and as we will see in 1958, and Charles de Gaulle becomes president of France. With all of its equivocal meanings, and so this is now we're getting into Now that we've
Yeah.
done
I
Korea,
mean,
we're getting into more.
people get the idea of how one country after the other can fall. I mean, if we do this mental experiment for a minute, let's imagine Korea fell. Next would be Japan. Next would be the Philippines. That's all lost. And of course, we've seen in recent decades how China, for example, moved into Africa. So you see a lot of Chinese activity in Africa. I mean, imagine if they take over Africa
And the Soviets and Cubans had moved into Africa in the
yeah,
1970s,
and
into
the Russians
Ethiopia,
exactly,
into Angola.
and the Russians and the Chinese, they move into Latin America. They have all these liberation movements there. They hate the gringos
Hmm.
and just have all happy communism. And then at some point, what allies are left for America? It's always this argument that we've seen so many times. Whenever there's a war, there's this argument: why should America get involved? Why should we be involved? Why should we be involved? But we see how one country after the other can fall, and at some point you're just plain out of allies, and then it becomes just an overwhelming force against the United States. So
And you can be economically isolated if most of the world
yeah,
is under communist control. They control all these resources, and your economy might not be able to function fully or efficiently without certain minerals that you can't get.
yeah, and of course the intelligence war has um, already reached American shores. I mean, like it's kind of the Red Dawn scenario, but hidden, right? Where you have all these people coming in and all these influences coming in, but it's not paratroopers. It's not like in the movie, the Red Dawn movie, but it's covert, right? So these people
Well,
are already
Mr.
there.
Wang of Luda Media told me in my last interview with him that the Chinese are presently infiltrating 250,000 soldiers into the U.S. through the southern border
Yeah,
as
the
as sleeper
Mexico
agent soldiers, right?
Mexico is being infiltrated as well heavily, and it just goes on and on and
Canada,
on, and
also Canada, yeah.
yeah, Canada is becoming kind of
We could talk about the Sidewinder report when we get there, but which is a report by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police and the Canadian Intelligence Service on how China was being infiltrated in the 19 Canada was being infiltrated by China in the 1990s. So the infiltration of the flanks of the U.S., which are Canada and Mexico, are our flanks
yeah,
to attack us across our borders because we have relatively open borders. We don't have militarized border with Mexico or Canada. I mean, I think the first fully demilitarized border, and certainly the longest one in the world, is the Canadian-U.S. border, which was settled after the War of 1812.
yeah, and
And
now we see
yeah,
all this talk about an American Civil War. There's a new movie out that I haven't seen yet about an American Civil War, and it's
yeah, yeah.
sort of this idea that somehow a part of the United States would leave the Union and open itself up to Russia and possibly China. And so this is where you would have a landing zone. This is when you would have a bridgehead into the United States where you could just bring in troops and equipment and whatnot. And so it's always about getting a foot in the door. It's just so you have a point to start, because usually in the past, before modern NBC weapons, an invasion of the United States was a silly idea, because you would have all these patriotic Americans owning firearms, modern firearms, owning the ammunition, owning all the supplies and all the
And
roads.
despite all that, Stalin formed an invasion army for Alaska.
Yeah,
He actually formed it. Yeah.
It can happen. It can happen, and eventually, if you run out of allies, this is of course the worst possible situation for the United States. And I mean, nowadays with Ukraine, if we draw the parallel to Ukraine, I mean, imagine how close Ukrainians would grow to the United States if Ukraine is defended, if Ukraine becomes a safe country for people to live, and that would make a great ally. This would make a great ally in Eastern Europe, essentially.
Yeah,
And
just
and
like South Korea has made a great ally,
and look at, I
right?
mean, look at these other places. I mean, Turkey used to be a staunch NATO country, and now we don't know where they stand. So you're losing one ally after the other. Germany is a mess. I mean, politically, it's a mess. We're all waiting for. I mean, we're all waiting for a conservative, a true conservative government that's pro-America, and we're not seeing this here. And so, do Americans want to lose one ally after the other until it's too late? This is kind of like the way this could be going. So this
Well,
is
Marjorie Taylor Greene thinks they can all go to hell.
yeah, I mean,
So
of course. I mean,
we don't need no stinking
she's
allies,
she's
right?
graduated. She's graduated from the Telegram YouTube University. I'm sure she knows everything about all these other countries, and it's just sort of a shift that needs to happen. You know, Americans becoming aware of other countries, the espionage, the conflicts, and just how the Russians operate. Because I mean, sometimes when you hear people talk, they know absolutely nothing about Russia because for the longest time it was a non-entity to them. It just didn't exist. They didn't care
Hmm.
about it. And then when it became really more aggressive overtly starting in 2008, this was married to a very large information operation telling people that the Russians are here to save us from the Illuminati, from the Zionist conspiracy. They're here to help. So
Oh,
they have this all backwards. They think these people think that America is occupied by these Jewish Illuminati, whatever, globalist forces. We are the occupied country, and the Russians are the best option for liberation. So it's like a complete distortion of reality. And when you see that people are lacking the fundamentals, when they don't even understand, it's almost World War III, and people are unaware of every single major actor in World War III. What do these people really know about the United States, even though they have American passports? What do they know about Russia? What do they know about China? What do they know about Iran? What do they know about the history of Iran? What do they know about, all these other places that war can break out,
they don't
Um,
know.
it,
That's the problem. Is look, all of this, that we talk about. There's so much to know. There's more than you and I can know. But we've studied, we've tried to have a coherent understanding and to share that understanding. And so, but when people literally accept the disinformation, and this is a real problem, it's not just that people, it's not what they don't know, it's what they think they know that's not true, that's been fed to them by their enemy, right?
yeah.
Which is really scary because wait a minute, do you know where that narrative comes from? That comes from the KGB, or that, it's like global warming or nuclear winter. The same math. It was invented by Russian scientists on orders of the KGB, of Andropov. And it's like, do you know where this comes from? It can't be true because its origin is false, right?
Yeah.
I
Also,
mean, if greenhouse gases are the cause of global warming, then it's an accident because nobody figured it out,
yeah.
right? Because the figuring is all phony.
And I discovered that it was not just Russia, Soviet Russia, just having such a great influence over conspiracy media in the West, in the Muslim world. It was not just the Russians. It can also be traced back to the British, and so it's interesting to me that Britain never really admitted to it. When influential British circles, what was it, the Duke of Northumberland, Alan Percy, very high-ranking British people who probably knew Lord Louis Mountbatten and his people. So these influential British, they were the ones who translated the fake protocols of Zion into English, and they published it in Britain, and they also sort of try to push it into America, where it was picked up by Henry Ford, from the car making company. And so the British never really owned up to their role in this conspiracy mythology that's now a major tool of the Russians, even though Britain at some point allowed a Jewish state, which they didn't before. Britain was running the area of Palestine, and Britain was considering its relationship with the Arab kingdoms, and so the Jews didn't really matter that much to the British at that point. So the British were really selling out the Jews. Jewish people were not allowed to escape from
And
Europe.
Hitler would have been totally scandalized by that,
Um,
by the way, because he thought the Jews were running the British and American
yeah, so the
governments, right?
Jews were not allowed to escape from Europe during World War II. And so at some point, the British allowed a tiny little Jewish state of Israel, but they never really owned up to their role in modern conspiracy mythology. And so actually when we destroy conspiracy mythology, which is actually easier to do than people could imagine, if we destroyed this conspiracy mythology, we could take a lot of pressure out of the situation. I mean, for example, the entire Muslim world, or part of the Muslim world, which tries to align with the Russians, like Iran,
Hmm.
if this conspiracy mythology falls flat on its face, this could actually change people's strategic decisions, and also
Yeah.
it would destroy the Russian propaganda for the American audience, telling them you're occupied by the elders of Zion and we're here to help you. You know, we can send forces,
Yeah.
we can send our troops, and you will be free of the Zionist, elders of Zion. We
Yeah,
can completely
the
destroy
big
them.
revelation for me on this came when I was in graduate school, and I had read, somebody had handed me a John Birch Society book on the Council on Foreign Relations and the Trilateral Commission and how bad they were. And I read it. You know, these are elite Western, organizations, involving the Western elite. And then I got, as part of a course that I was taking, I had to read a book by a communist on the Council on Foreign Relations and the Trilateral Commission. And when I finished the book, I couldn't believe it. Both books had the same content, the same criticisms, the same hatred of the Council on Foreign Relations and the Trilateral Commission. They were identical in content.
Yeah,
One written by a Bircher and the other written by a communist. And that was when it hit me all of a sudden, wait a minute.
it's the same
How
thing.
can
Yeah,
this be?
it's
Right?
Leninism.
How can the Birch Society be, in one of its books, be perfectly in alignment with the communists? It just can't accidentally happen, right? And
Yeah, I
that's
mean,
when I started looking at the Birch Society closer, looking at the idea. And then it's when I, going through speeches of Khrushchev in the research library, I found his 1957 speech where he said, "We have to form our own anti-communist organization in America. We have to tweak American anti-communism so it's not effective against us
yeah,
anymore."
and ironically, when the Birch Society was so dominant in the Cold War and they had these multi-million copy best-selling books out, they built themselves as the best anti-communist organization in the world, the most important one. But their material was not just anti-American. When you talk about the Gilded Age of American industrialism, so obviously America had to have larger corporations and have more production, and not these two people companies or these five people companies. But by designating the American industrial push in the late 1800s and early 20th century, by designating that as a Jewish-led conspiracy, that's anti-American on its face. I mean, of course, you can re-look at history and figure out, was this over the top in some ways? Was this constitutional in some ways? But by branding it a Jewish-led foreign conspiracy, that's anti-American. And also, all this Birch material from the United States, this Birch material found its way to Germany, the country where I live. So this was in the 70s and the 80s, and then in the 90s, of course, they still used that material. They were translating entire books from the Birch Society into German, or people would make a compilation, a mixtape. They would take stuff, copy whole passages from these Birch books from America, translating it and assembling a new book for the German audiences, and this became such a big problem because all of this conspiracy movement here, there was this German conspiracy movement that was so much based on the Birch Society from America. This German conspiracy movement became probably even more anti-American, or as anti-American as the left. All this stuff you see today, when people say, we hate America, it's run by the elders of Zion, America is responsible for every bad thing in the world. if Germans are saying this is because of the influence of these German conspiracy books, which are based on the American
And
conspiracy books.
now, of
I
course,
mean, could you
Americans,
imagine?
yeah, I wouldn't, in the 90s and 80s, I wouldn't have thought of the Birch Society as anti-American. I would have just thought of them as being oriented in a way that they weren't seeing the enemy, the communist enemy, correctly. But then what you just said about Germany, it's happened here. Now we've got the Americans who are influenced by this conspiracy model, saying America's the bad guy in the world, and that the problem is in Washington, not in Moscow or Beijing. And this is really, now it's like I'm stunned. It's like I could see how they were trying to develop this, thinking, oh, they could never make this work in America. And now I see that they've succeeded because of the collapse of the Soviet Union, so called, and them pretending not to be at the top in Russia, not to be communist, even though Lenin's out there in his mausoleum on Red Square
Mm-hmm.
still being worshipped. They're still working with all the communist countries around the world, helping them to advance themselves. They're considered, Putin's considered a nationalist Christian, which is like, oh my gosh, how simple can you be?
Yeah.
But this is where we are now, and it's like you almost can't resist it, because it's been built up through all these publications, through all these decades, and the people that have followed it all along have been strung along, and then the twist at the end, oh, guess what? You're with Alex Jones, and you're
Mm-hmm.
really against your own country. And
Yeah.
the fact that you've got people like Biden in the White House, look, his own Secret Service guards would shoot him if he actually acted out what Moscow wants him to do. So you don't have full communist control in America. You have a kind of distortion of American politics and a sabotaging of America by those people who are working with the communists. Those people who have a communist agenda. It's terrible. They're in the FBI, they're in the State Department, they're in the CIA, they're in the FBI, they're in the Justice Department. Okay, it's worse than it was at the end of World War II, where they were infiltrating us. But we came back from that. If you just expose it, you can preserve your institutions. But the idea is now to inspire a civil war in America. And I haven't seen that movie. I saw it at the movie theater here. It's here, and maybe I should go see it. But I'm not sure I want to give money to the people who made it. I've heard it's from a left-wing point of view, right? Is that what you've heard?
Which movie was that?
The Civil War movie, the American Civil War movie
No, I
that's
haven't.
out.
I haven't seen it yet. I just saw
Yeah.
some
No,
graphics.
somebody told me it was anti-conservative or pro-left. So I have to see it. But you see, the thing is that you got people being agitated on both sides, on the left and the right, being made hysterical by a certain kind of rhetoric to have a kind of conflict here in this country. This is what we absolutely mustn't have, right?
Yeah.
All we have to do is understand that we have an outside enemy. We have to be united, and we have to be more intelligent and not ideological. We need to be Americans, non-ideological
and also
Americans.
when we talk about an intelligence war, you need to be aware of the balance of that war, just like with a conventional war. And when we look at the Chinese society and we look at the Russian society, these are closed societies where any sort of complaining is immediately recognized and tracked and punished. And there's no option for foreign people to come in and set up structures and do things and have a look around and contact people and find sources. So by having this asymmetry, right? I mean, even this asymmetry in and of itself should cause America to put a great emphasis on counterintelligence, because it's nice to be very open and have all this, these people come in and foreign companies and influencers and such, but when it's that tense and you're not supposed to get any sort of window into China and Russia, you're not supposed to know anything about them, but they can come into the West and they can snoop around and recruit sources. This asymmetry in and of itself is too dangerous. So, I mean, when you talk about the closing down of Russia Today, the television station, and subsequent permits being revoked in Europe for these Russian television stations and media entities, people started to complain, oh, this isn't liberty, you can't censor, blah blah blah. I mean, this is asymmetrical. There is no real foreign media in the East that can really operate properly and just document what's going on in Russia, and so
Yeah, they can pour poison all over us through our universities and our entertainment and our news, and we are not able to respond.
yeah,
You know,
it's like you
you
cannot
can't. Yeah.
you cannot even have smaller media outlets in Russia that will document the abuses and the forced mobilization of young men to fight in the Ukraine war. You cannot talk to the mothers of the dead soldiers. You cannot document the poverty in Russia and the subsidization of many, many millions of families through the government, which is broke. And they try to buy off some segments of the population by giving them housing loans and all kinds of government subsidies. And you cannot document all of this because it's a closed system. And so we're past that point. We've been long past that point of being that kind of an open society where we let these people in and these corporations in. And we need to put a focus on a patriotic style of counterintelligence, where you can... You stick to the Constitution, you protect the liberties of Americans, but you're not handing the keys to people you don't really know, right? It's just
That's the
red
problem,
carpet,
is that we have
red carpet treatment.
we have agents of China and Russia in our economy and big business and government, and that's a problem. So anyway, this has been our discussion. We've got through the Korean War. We're around 1954, so we can continue next week with the origins of the Vietnam War, the Algerian War, and of course, we should cover the Suez Crisis as well of 1956, the Hungarian Revolution of 1956 that coincided, and try to make it up to the Kennedy administration, if not get further into the 60s. So that will be our call for next week, and I want to thank you for joining us. I'm Jeff Nyquist. This has been Friends and Enemies, and with me has been Alex Benesch in Germany.